Well, if we could all assume the position, folks, there. Ms. Barth.
Ms. Barth.
Hi, Mary. Hi, Mary.
You got to watch yourself, Jim. She's
so I'd like to call this joint meeting of West Pierce Fire and Rescue Board and the Lakewood City Council to order. We'll proceed with a roll call, a non-agenda item to get an agenda item for West Pierce cleared up. Then we'll do some self-introductions before we move to the 911 presentation. So, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Barth. Present. Councilmember Boki. Present. Councilmember Brandstetter. Here. Councilmember Moss. Here. Councilmember Simpson. Here. Deputy Mayor Whalen.
Present.
Mayor Anderson.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Do you roll?
We don't do a roll call.
Okay. Well then, in keeping with our practice, I'd ask you to all rise with me in a moment of silence in honor of our men and women serving overseas, followed by the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So I now yield to Board Chair Dalton.
Okay, do I have an approval, motion to approve the agenda? Do I have a second?
Second.
Got that. Any changes to the consent agenda? Hearing none, we'll proceed on. That's it. Short and sweet.
We didn't get in your way. You could actually watch basketball. So now maybe we start over with Chief Sharp and go around and give self-introductions, because although most of us know each other, I don't think it's universal.
Chief Jim Sharp with West Pierce Fire and Rescue. I'm Mike Brandstetter. I'm on the Lakewood City Council, and I'm on the policy board for South Carolina.
John Simpson, Lakewood City Council.
John Clancy with West Pierce Fire and Rescue.
Bart Dalton, Board Chair for West Pierce.
Don Anderson, City of Lakewood.
Jason Whalen, Lakewood City Council.
John Sheeran with West Pierce and Vice Chair.
Marie Barth, Lakewood City Council.
Paul Boki, Lakewood City Council. Dave Buer, West Pierce Fire and Rescue. Andrew Knights from South Carolina.
I'm Karen Reed. I'm a local government consultant. I was working with Council on executive committee.
Well, thank you all for being here. Now recognize Andrew Knights, no stranger to these environs, Executive Director of South Sound 911, to give us a governance briefing.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Chairman and members of the Council and members of the Board. I'd like to start off by congratulating you all. This is, I believe, a somewhat historic meeting, because it's not every day that the City Council and the Board of Commissioners meet together. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if anyone recalls when it last happened. This is also a historic evening because both West Pierce and the City of Lakewood played key initiation roles, if you will, in establishing South Sound 911 6 years ago, and it's in many ways a sign of Lakewood's leadership, if you will, from both a police, a fire, and a governmental standpoint. So your two entities represent two of what originally was 5 founding partners, and so that is significant as well. It's also the historic occasion because the city attorney actually offered me a cup of tea, which in over 8 years of Monday night city council meetings, she never had offered me that before. So, we have to take history as it comes. The purpose of this evening is to discuss with you a proposed change to the governance and the organizational structure of South Sound 911 now that we're 6 years old. And it's specifically a recommendation that we would move forward from being an administrative agency formed under the Interlocal Cooperation Act to a public authority. And we'll walk through briefly the reasons for that change. These recommendations have come from a group of what we call informally the Interlocal Executive Group, because the 6 governments that established South Sound 911, which consists, of course, of the City of Lakewood and West Pierce Fire, but also includes the City of Tacoma, Pierce County, the City of Fife, and last but not least, the City of Puyallup. So the 6 governmental entities who are, I refer to as our owners, have designated executive level representatives who have formed a team that have worked on this proposal over the course of the last, I'd say, 6 to 9 months. And specifically from Pierce County, we have from the County Executive's Office, Don Anderson, who's wearing a different hat this evening. We have from City of Tacoma, representing the City Manager, Steve Victor. And then from the City of Lakewood, your own City Manager, John Caulfield, Hyun Kim, the City Manager of Fife, Jim Sharp, Chief of West Pierce, and then Kevin Yamamoto, the City Manager of Puyallup. So these 6 individuals have come together in a consensus process that we'll discuss to make a proposal that we'll walk through this evening. So the presentation is not, even though I'm introducing it, it's not a South Sound 911 Executive Director proposal. It's a proposal coming from the 6 governments, and I say that because it's appropriate that that's where it would come from. I have with me this evening Karen Reed, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, who's played a key role as a consultant. She has a unique background, both a legal background and an intergovernmental background, and she's worked most recently with Snohomish County, that's gone through a consolidation of public safety communications and a number of other agencies in the area. I also have Peter Beckwith, our legal counsel, with me this evening. The person who would have been here, but unfortunately she had to be out of town on a vacation, is Deanna Gregory from Pacifica Law Group, who also played a key role and has been very active in the formation of other public authorities around the state. So she has been bond counsel to Lakewood at times, as well as City of Tacoma and Puyallup. So she's somewhat uniquely qualified and played a key role in this proposal. So very briefly, since all of you are somewhat familiar with who we are, what is South Sound 911? We, over the course of the last 6 years, so we're still relatively new, provide emergency communication services to all police and fire agencies. So we're talking about 19 police agencies, certainly Lakewood Police Department is one of them, and 22 fire departments, certainly West Pierce is one of them. In addition, we provide, due in large part to our predecessor agencies' work, the law enforcement record services, which is somewhat unique. Many communications agencies don't also provide a full record system for police agencies, but we do that for Tacoma, the Sheriff's Department, Lakewood, and most of the others. We are currently formed as a governmental administrative agency, as I mentioned, and we are governed by the 6 entities who I referred to a moment ago as our owners. In terms of the work that we do, we handle about 2,500 calls a day, and so we are a very busy agency, and there's not a whole lot of room for error in terms of how we handle the work that we do. And so our work has evolved, and even though it's not part of the presentation, I will, with some pride, call attention to the fact that just a few days ago, actually last week, we started text to 911 services, which is much more than a convenience. It's actually a necessity for a lot of people who have different reasons for not being able to speak. And I'm very pleased that after 1 week, the numbers are manageable, so they have not been overwhelming at all. We've had between 27 and 30 calls, which is about what we expected. But much more importantly, we've had some very, in my mind, very clearly some very life-saving situations. A number of domestic violence issues where someone was not able to speak because she was concerned about being heard by someone who was on the other side of the wall. And so we've a service that we are pleased to now be providing. So the question then before us is, why explore a new governance model? Essentially, we have evolved. Now that we're 6 years old, the model we started with, which had a very integrated operations board made up exclusively of police and fire chiefs, and a policy board of elected officials from the 6 entities. That's the model we evolved with, and so there's been a lot of talk about, is there a better model going forward? In addition, there's the concern about liability. Under our present structure, is there enough liability protection for our 6 owners? And there's a belief behind this proposal that we can perhaps take on more of our liability and leave the 6 of our owner agencies, including the 2 of you, in a better position. This was also viewed as an opportunity for a more representative governing board, because in addition to the 6 entities that I've mentioned, we have cities and fire districts from Gig Harbor to the west to Buckley and Eatonville to the east, and there's a whole lot of diversity in how Pierce County is structured, and there was a thought that we could do a better job of representing that. There's also a desire to move to what would be considered a more traditional governance model, so that the executive director position would have clear lines of authority to the board of directors and would actually be appointed by the board of directors, which today is different in the fact that the appointment is actually by the operations board. There's also a desire that Southside 911 as a legal entity ought to be able to own property and have other powers that a separate legal entity could have. And then if in the future there was a need for issuance of debt, which is not planned today through the public authority, but could be planned in the future, that a new structure would enable that. Contrary to what other comments I've heard in the last week, there's no move to give us new taxing authority or to do anything similar to that would cause concern for any of our constituent groups. What I'd like to now is turn the presentation over to Karen.
Good evening. It's nice to be here to see you all tonight. I'm going to speak about what the group of 6 chief executives have come up with as a proposal for moving forward with South Sound 911's governance. My role in working with them was basically as a facilitator. I do a lot of governance and finance work when lots of local governments want to come together and do something together jointly, and they have to figure out, okay, how are we going to make decisions? How are we going to fund this? What's the legal structure we're going to use? And so I do a lot of work like that. As Andrew mentioned, I recently worked with Snow Common, Snowpack up in Snohomish County on the merger that went through, and then subsequently the merger to Snow 911 of SIRS, the radio agency. So, and before that, I worked with a group of 13 cities and fire districts in East King County to help establish NORCOM, and just went through several phases of effort over a couple of years to help them think, what do they want to do? What are their interests? How can they work together? And then work through the details of how you structure finance and governance for an multi-agency critical public safety service. So that, again, was my role here. I was called in after folks had decided on a corporate structure, the Public Development Authority, and asked to work with them to sort of say, well, how would we govern this thing? What's going on now? Could we make that better? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here tonight. Andrew has shared with you the reasons why the group wanted to do that. We started by looking around Washington State at what other 911 agencies of a regional nature, either countywide or large parts of the county, have done. How have they chosen to structure their governance. What corporate agency form did they use? What do their boards look like? And the answer is there is no one answer, surprisingly not. Everybody comes to their own solutions based on the mix of people at play at the table and what their situations are. There's some commonality in what folks have done. They usually try to have a board that's not super large so that it's kind of unwieldy. People are usually thinking about, if it's a regional service agency, how can we make it a regional representative board? How can we make a structure that is stable and can still evolve over time as our situations change? So you want stability in terms of predictable processes and an ability to get things done that you need to get done. Like, we need a budget every year. We need to make sure we can do that, and then nobody can mess with that at the last second. So there's some common challenges that everybody comes to try to sort through in these conversations, but the answers are always developed locally based on the players at the table, and that, of course, is what happened here. After we looked at a lot of what other folks have been doing around Washington State, and the folks had agreed on a PDA as seeming to be the best approach to go, and I'm going to speak a little bit about that. I worked with them on some principles around governance. What is important to you about how a board would work for this agency? What should it look like? What should it be able to do? What should it not be able to do? And the group agreed on a set of goals and principles around that, and we worked from there, working through, probably dozens of options to try to come up with the proposal we have here. It evolved over the course of getting input from some of the folks around this table. We talked to the policy board, we talked with the Fire Chiefs Association and the Cities and Towns Association, and we recently talked to the Pierce County Council. Anyway, the proposal that you're hearing tonight has evolved over the last 6 months as we've gotten input from folks, and you'll hear about where it is tonight. Yes, that is where we are tonight, presenting our recommendations for feedback. So the first point I want to talk about is, why did they choose a public development authority model? In part, I was not there for that particular discussion, but under state law, there are darn few options you actually have as a group of local governments to create a separate legal entity, somebody that can sue and be sued and sign contracts and have employees and do all those things that you want South Sound 911 to be able to do. Your choices under state law are, you could be a nonprofit corporation whose members are local government agencies. I've worked with a number of folks that have chosen that form. You can be a partnership. I don't know anyone that's chosen that form, because under that, as you may know, or may not know, that a partner, any one of the partners can waltz in and commit the rest of them without any paper backing them up, and that can be, as you imagine, a little problematic. And the other structure that is often turned to in this state, I think over 30 times now, is a public development authority. It's based on a statute that has been around since the 1970s. It was first set up so that local governments could accept federal grants and manage them in a sort of a siloed way that didn't have to be run through the city councils all the time. Whatever, it has evolved, and now we have everything from the Pike Place Market to a tourism authority in South County to other regional 911 centers and other folks all around the map that have chosen the SCORE, South County Jail in King County as a PDA. So it's really a tried and true model that a lot of folks have chosen, and there's a detailed statutes in place for how they can be structured and the flexibility they do and do not have. And it's worked out fairly well for folks. Some things to understand about PDAs: they do not have eminent domain authority. They can't take anybody's property. They have no taxing authority. They cannot impose taxes on anyone. All they can do to raise revenue is to get contracts for services from their member agencies or other folks. They're clearly separate legal agencies, as I talked about before. They must be chartered by either a city or a county, one city or county. So that's one of the key fun discussions folks had to have is, well, if we go down this route, you know, it's like the mice and the cat. Who will bell the cat? Who is going to charter the PDA? And it could not have been a fire district. They're not authorized under state law to charter a PDA. So the city of Tacoma stepped up and said, we will serve as a chartering agency. What does that mean, really? How important is that? You'll see the bullet on the slide. Essentially, it boils down to the chartering agency has to approve changes in the charter, where your board structure and things are laid out, and they also retain the right to approve or disapprove a dissolution of the agency, should it come to that. PDAs can issue debt, but those can't be tax-secured debt, right? It would have to be debt secured by revenues from contracts that they have. The South Sound financing structure that we're talking about is not impacted by this PDA structure. It will basically, it can be seamless, except there will be the legal box in which it's residing will change. But other than that, the customers should not notice any differences from this transition to a PDA structure. And as I mentioned, Tacoma's recommended and has volunteered to serve as the chartering agency. If there are questions on this stage, otherwise I'll move on to the next part of it. All right, Councilmember?
Mr. Branstetter.
There you are.
I just wonder if you could expound upon the seeming conflict between one of the reasons for forming was to reduce risk and financial risk, particularly amongst the agencies, with the bullet that says the commitments of the 6 parties regarding financing does not change.
Well, that's a good point. It does not change to the extent that you each of the 6 agencies have separate financing agreements with the county to secure as a sort of a double backstop pledge on the current county debt. Those agreements remain unchanged.
No, I think we anticipate that those go away.
I didn't hear that they were, I heard they were remaining in place, that the interlocal agreement will go away as it's currently structured. But maybe you know more than I do about getting rid of this. Last I heard, those financing agreements would remain.
It was kind of my understanding, and in some of the discussions I had, that that is one of the central reasons to do that, and that there'd be some reduction in firm commitments of the current 6 with regards to financing. You know that we would go to the financing sources, but that the 6 agencies wouldn't be in a backstopping situation.
I think, Mr. Branstetter, that is the case, that we're evolving to a different structure where each of the 6, there are unique roles. The county is, Pierce County is doing the financing of the new facility, which obviously involves debt, as the county did for 2 previous bond issues for the radio purchases. However, the revenues to cover the repayment is within the what we have forecast for the time that we have the revenue. So there's no, as far as I'm concerned, there's no real risk involved with that. The commitment on the part of the entities to support South 911 through their annual allocation to pay for dispatch services does continue, but as is the case in today's arrangement, any of the parties could actually back out if they so chose. So I think what we're proposing is a situation where, aside from this backstopping issue, I don't believe that Pierce County is asking for any continuing backstopping provision, but is simply taking on the debt. And so I think all the parties will be better off with less commitment long-term financially with the future arrangement.
So in fairness, I don't know that Ms. Reed's seen today's ILA. It was the overly simplified one. I think that,
I did see that, and I saw that all the financing terms are taken out of that.
So currently there's what you call backstopping, Mr. Branstetter, is the provision that essentially says that the 6 will pay they'll pay a higher fee for their services if the bond can't be covered by the tax, because it was an attempt to overly simplified, it was an attempt to dance around this being allocated to the debt of different municipalities because Tacoma had no capacity and wouldn't do it, and Lakewood were reluctant to do that. I think what Mr. Knights is saying is it's not anticipated going forward that provision will be in there, though the financing contemplates that there will be general obligation bonds by the county to fund pass-through to fund the construction of the building, kind of leased to own to South Sound 911, repaid from the 1/10 of 1% as it comes by. If the 1/10 of 1% is not enough, South Sound 911's general revenues from subscriber services, for example, would be allocated to make those payments under financing agreement to the county, and that may at some point require an increase in rates. But there's quite a bit of coverage under the taxing capacity, so that's very hypothetical. So that would be siloed, and in addition, as far as liability goes, now we may have some contingent liability if South Sound 911 sued and somebody decides to sue all the member agencies, where this would be a standalone corporate entity that provides an additional liability shield. So we get some advantage that way.
Yeah, I guess that what I gathered from that was we were moving from a point that in that unanticipated but potential eventuality, the current agreement had the 6 entities increasing their subscriber contribution, and that under the PDA, I thought that from what I read, that we would really be at the point of where all 23 subscribers, because the allocation for subscribers would be spread across all 23, not just the 6.
I think that's fair. They'd it would be raising rates.
And the number is actually 41. I mean, when you add up the 19 police agencies and the 22 fire agencies, so the allocations would be spread much more evenly and regionally.
One kind of technical distinction too is something needs to be cleaned up very easily, is that South Sound 911 now has subscriber agreements with everybody but the 6. So the standard subscriber agreement would be Lakewood, West Pierce would be signing up as a customer and sign the same rate, same subscriber agreement that everybody else has. So
that was fun. Sorry, I did speak with Peter and Deanna and Steve about that this morning, and I had absolutely what you're saying about the current ILA and how it's going to change. I have a different understanding about the existing financing agreements. So
as you said, all that financing stuff got moved out into a different bucket.
It definitely got moved out. So are there any questions about the PDA form? Okay. So this is the current structure that is in South Sound 911. There is a 10-member policy board. The only representatives are from the 6 signatories of the ILA. There is an operations board that every member sends folks to. That operations board is divided into a police and fire side, and both of those sides must agree together in order to make, and each has 1 vote, in order to make any recommendation forward to the policy board. You can see how the seats are allocated on the policy board currently. The policy board does appoint 1 person to represent all cities under 50,000, but there's only 1 seat for all the fire agencies in the county. Did you want to speak?
Just one additional historical footnote. Some of you may recall there was a time prior to South Sound 911 when the city of Lakewood had a lot of concerns about its lack of having a seat at the table in the predecessor model for law enforcement dispatch, which was called LISA, the Law Enforcement Support Agency. And for a number of years, as a fairly new city, Lakewood was really taking a back seat. They were expected to pay a lot of money for the service, but they weren't in a voting position on the board. Eventually that changed somewhat. I bring this up as historical interest because what we have evolved to with South Sound 911 is certainly on the fire side, having Lakewood play a leadership role with West Pierce and what was FireCom being a part of South Sound. But on the law enforcement side, we have also had a major step forward with not just with Mr. Brandstetter on the policy board as a voting member since day one, but with Chief Zarro as recently the chair of the operations board, as well as Chief Sharp as the current chair of the operations board. So I say all that, even though our structure is evolving, just to point out that if you turn the clock back just a few years, we were not at the table, and now we're pretty much chairing the table.
Okay, so that's where we are today, and the proposal looking forward is like that's shown on this particular slide. The size of the executive board is proposed to increase by one. It would be called the Board of Directors, and it would have 8 city and county seats and 3 representing fire districts. And again, going back to some of the points that Andrew made earlier, the group felt that this was still a workable number as compared to 10 or some higher number. It was more inclusive of the customers of the agency. And as they worked through the proposal that you'll hear in a little bit, the number of seats allocated across was designed to sort of reflect the workload that each of the customers is imposing on the agency. And rather than have sort of this bifurcated responsibility between the existing policy board and the ops board, they're going to put all governance responsibilities and authority in the single executive board so that Andrew doesn't have 2 groups of people telling him what to do. He just has to worry about the board. He will, of course, take the input from the chiefs group and the ops group, but there's clearly the executive board is the person to whom he will report, which is a more traditional straight line governance structure. The operations committee is substantially expanded. Each of the appointing agencies would appoint a member there, and there would be also a small fire rep appointed by the Chiefs Association and up to 9 additional members that Andrew could nominate that would have to be confirmed by the board of directors. And I'm going to go in next to a little bit more detail on each of these. So here's the board of directors broken down a little bit. And the way the folks decided to allocate the seats was based on the size of the communications assessments that they would be paying in a year. Every year you guys will get you currently get a new notice of your assessment in the fall from South Sound 911, how much they're going to be charging you next year for providing the 911 services. And what we would do here is look at who has the largest such assessment and all those by rank at the point that you're making these appointments and allocate the seats based on the chart here. So the 2 largest jurisdictions in terms of the size of their communications assessments would each get 2 seats. That happens to be Pierce County and Tacoma, not in that order. In terms of absolute size, Tacoma is the largest. 3rd and 4th largest jurisdictions in terms of their communications assessments would each get 1 seat. 5th, 6th, and 7th largest jurisdictions would share 2 seats and also represent all the smaller cities. Then on the fire side, going from 1 seat up to 3, the 2 largest fire districts in terms of the communications assessments would each get 1 seat. That is where you folks would come in on West Pierce, and all other fire districts would share 1 seat appointed by the Pierce County Fire Commissioners Association. So what does that really mean? If we were going to do this right now today, based on the 2019 assessments, this is how the seats would work out. You've probably had a chance to see this. Tacoma and Pierce County councils would each be appointing 2 seats, although if local rules dictate a different appointing process, the local rules would govern. Lakewood would have a seat, Puyallup would have a seat to appoint. Again, it would be the city council making these appointments. And the 5th, 6th, and 7th largest cities would get together and they would jointly make an appointment of 2 additional seats, as well as understanding that those 2 people will be representing all the smaller cities. On the fire side, you can see Central Pierce, West Pierce, and then again, the Pierce County Fire Commissioners Association making the appointments. Some additional terms, and these are some of the things that have evolved since the group first started its consideration of options. All of the board members would be selected by the legislative bodies, again, unless local rules dictate otherwise. All the board members would need to be elected officials from the appointing agency. Could be a mayor, could be a council member. Or in the case of Pierce County, the Pierce County could also appoint the sheriff to serve on one of its 2 seats if it chose to. Each board member will have an alternate. That alternate can be an elected official, or if the local agency chooses, it could be a chief administrative officer or police chief or fire chief or someone appointing to those types of folks. So one designated alternate for each board seat appointed by the appointing authority. There'd be 3-year board terms, no term limits, and we had a lot of input about staggering those terms, but because of the way that the group decided that they wanted to select the board seats, rank order of communications assessments, that can change year to year. So the boards would have to be, in order to make sure you're not like appointing based on totally different slates of who's on first and who's on second, you just be appointing all 11 members at one point in time, and then 3 years later, they would be appointed again. Everybody would have another choice to make, same person or a different person. Again, no term limits. The group talked about the issues of how is that really at a large risk for unstable membership of the board? Could we lose everybody at once? Well, I think the conclusion of the group was technically, yes, you could lose everybody at once, but folks thought that that was very unlikely to happen, and it was a manageable situation. And every board member has 1 vote, except on the supermajority vote items. Are there questions so far?
I just note on that, one of the considerations on that staggering is because people's terms as elected officials expire at different times, there's going to be some natural staggering. Somebody may be elected to a 3-year term on the board 2 years into their term and not run for re-election 2 years later, so they would be replaced then. So there'll be some unintended staggering that takes place.
Mm-hmm. And if you lose somebody, if your board appointee decides no longer to serve in office, you just have that opportunity to step in and appoint a replacement for them at that point. That's how it would work. Councilmember?
Yeah, I wonder if you could just speak to, going back 6 years, going back 8 years, into getting this together, to pull it together, and to get it on a ballot. To get approved by voters. One of the topics that was a matter of discussion at that time had to do with the balance between police and fire. And that was ultimately addressed by the check and balance in the operations board, where certain decisions were going to be made, by that nothing could come out of the operations board unless a majority of the fire votes and a majority of the law enforcement votes did that. Now, I noticed that in the move to an operations committee, the slides didn't particularly make that provision for committee recommendations under the new governance structure, and there is a clear imbalance in majority-minority because of their structure and weighted according to calls. So obviously I'm in Lakewood, and we don't have a fire piece other than that we have a close affinity with West Pierce to be able to go and do that. But I should maybe I would ask some of my colleagues on the fire side, Chief, or one of the commissioners, is that is a new structure have an adequate check or balance in that regard?
There we go. Yeah, Councilmember Branster, just being someone who's, I'm currently the chair of the operations board, and I've sat through not only this process, but I was at the beginning of the process when we first made a conscious decision, as you said, to have two boards for some of that checks and balances. And I will say, as Director Knight had said earlier, that we've evolved quite a ways as an organization from that time. And at that time, if you recall, fire and police were very separate, and a lot of what South Sound 911 is today was being built off of an evolution, which was the former Law Enforcement Support Agency, or LISA, which was a very police-centric agency. And so there's a lot of concern that fire was going to get kind of lost in the shuffle or marginalized there. And so that's, you know, that's where some of that perception and need came from originally, was a need to kind of set a foundation. I believe that foundation has been set, and you know, I think I can speak pretty fairly for all the fire ops board members, that they feel that we've come a long ways to recognize that fire is an integral part of public safety. And by expanding the 3 members on the policy board gives that better representation as well. So I feel like that it's been addressed, and we're also at a very different time today than we were 8 years ago.
Thank you. I want to come back to something that you said, Mr. Knight. You correctly pointed out that in 2003, Lakewood was a non-voice on the LISA board. I was there, and I remember the then County Executive John Ladenburg telling me Lakewood would not get a vote. Now, to play the devil's advocate man, if I live in cities 8 through 21 on this board of directors scheme, what is to keep me from feeling like Lakewood did in 2003 when it comes to a voice in how this board is run?
That's a great question, Councilmember Simpson. As I think Karen might have mentioned in the presentation, there is the 5th, 6th, and 7th cities who actually have already come to an agreement, very remarkable, a couple of sessions that Bonnie Lake Sumner and Fife had together to decide what the order would be. One of those seats would represent the small cities, and would do so with the actual weight of their collective call volume. And so they would have a quantifiable vote in terms of moving forward. I do think it will still take outreach on the part of the agency. You know, it doesn't just happen with the formality of the vote. You know, when I go to places like Buckley and Gig Harbor, they kind of want to know that they are cared about. And so that's been a part of what we've done over the last several years, and that really needs to be the case going forward. But I believe we can do that.
Okay. So I'm just going to cover a last couple of slides here about, this is further detail about how the board of directors would work. And the group, after a lot of discussion, picked a handful of items that they thought, these are so important that we shouldn't just be doing things like this on a simple majority. We should have some kind of a supermajority vote for these types of issues. And these are the issues that they selected. It's a fairly, it's a similar type of list that you would see in other types of interlocal agencies. Issuing debt by the PDA or a member agency, appointing Andrew, but not firing Andrew. That would be a simple majority vote. Amending the charter or bylaws, expanding the scope of services. You are delegating to this agency your responsibility for 911 call response. If they decide to do something different, you really want to make sure you had a supermajority before you expanded the scope of what they were up to. And then, you know, sale of all or substantially all of the assets, merger, consolidation, and dissolution, supermajority items. And then also long-term leases of property or acquisition of real property. So those were the items that they thought were most important. We should have a really strong supermajority to get there. So how do you define the supermajority? People do that differently everywhere you go. This is where these folks ended up after looking at a lot of different options. They decided to go with a supermajority at 2/3 or 66% of the weighted vote. And they are defining the weighted vote as being your percentage share of your communications assessment as compared to all other agencies, all other 41 agencies, okay? So that's not a terribly unusual approach to supermajority voting, and it will be easily calculable in any year what everybody's precise weight is, because the budget will have been approved for the year, and so you won't have a lot of uncertainty about how things will come forward. And it also works out that no one agency, this was an important principle for them in looking at their options here, no single agency voting no could stop a supermajority action from happening. So, and I should also mention that there's no requirement that the 2 seats from Tacoma or Pierce County must vote in the same way. They could split their vote on opposite sides of an issue. Everybody's one for all for one in this. So that was, those are the only things I wanted to speak to about governance, but I'm happy to answer any other questions about the governance proposal. All right. So the current interlocal agreement to which both of your agencies are party requires unanimous consent to change, which makes this has made it a really interesting conversation. Everybody at the table has an equal say in, are we going to make a change here? Well, if it doesn't work for somebody, it's not going to happen. So everybody has to either be mildly uncomfortable or something along those lines to come up with a compromise that they're all willing to recommend to their legislative bodies. And I think that's where they ended up, and they worked really hard at it, and it was a pleasure to work with this group. They're very fun. So we'll continue to be talking to the legislative bodies such as yourself. I think we're going to Puyallup next week, and as was clear earlier, there was some shifting of some of the financing conditions and where those appear and what are they made last week. But other than that, it's sort of more, we're aiming into sort of settling things into more form rather than function, where the documents should be finalized soon. And your agencies would be approving an ordinance to adopt a new interlocal agreement that would terminate the existing one, that would approve the change of South Sound 911 from an interlocal administrative agency to a PDA chartered by Tacoma. The charter will be appended to the ILA, so it's, it's consideration for the transaction that this charter is going to look like this as we start out, and we understand how that charter can be changed going forward. And then at that point, terminating the existing agreement, the transition would happen at some point later this year, but the date is flexible depending on how things come together with all the parties to finally approve things, and it's also contingent on a further agreement between the county and South Sound 911 with respect to commitment of the sales and use tax and the enhanced 911 tax to the agency. And that will happen, as I said, they're expecting it to happen mid-year sometime, and will have to happen by the end of this year, or we'll go back to the drawing board. And that's, I think, those are the main steps for transition. What would you want to add to that?
Could you explain for the group what authority Tacoma does and doesn't have over a PDA once it is formed?
Once it is formed. Yeah, the core things come down to approving. They have to consent to changes in your charter. If you're going to change the charter, they are the ones that initially approve the charter, and you have to, if you're going to change it, the board would have to say, we would like to make this change in our charter, and they would have to take that back to the Tacoma Council and get them to approve it. If for some reason the law changed and the charter was out of alignment with current law and the South Sound 911 board did not get around to fixing that misalignment, the city manager in Tacoma can fix that so that you're not out of whack. And the city is also able to dissolve the PDA. I think the current language says that they would have to give you all a year's notice before they could take that action. And so you would be involved in that, any kind of decision there, but ultimately it's the decision of the City Council of Tacoma if they choose to dissolve it. So the group spent a lot of time like, well, that would be a bad thing. We all need 911 service. What's going to happen? So the structure that is in there now says if that happens, part of that dissolution, a condition of that dissolution has to be identifying a successor agency and providing for them to take over the service responsibility in a seamless way. Does that help, Don?
The final slide is a reference to the project that we have for our new Public Safety Communications Center and the financing. And so to link what Karen has just presented to where we go from here, all 6 of the governing entities, as was mentioned, need to approve of a change in governance if it's to move forward. There are some unique additional steps that certainly the City of Tacoma is being asked to take in terms of the chartering of the public authority. And as I mentioned earlier, Pierce County is stepping up to taking some additional steps for the financing of the facility. And so we are on a tight timeline in the sense that by the end of May, we are scheduled to go out to bid so that bids can be returned 2 months later, and then construction can start by the 1st of September. So there is work to be done, and fortunately Pierce County has agreed to meet those timelines, and so we're working cooperatively with Pierce County to allow that to happen, which is in support of obviously all the rest of the entities to do that. And of course, we're working closely with the City of Tacoma to, on their additional steps as well. So we present this to you this evening for your information. It is our hope that we would see the adoption of the new governance model by all 6 entities, hopefully by mid-June or thereabouts is what our goal is, in order to then set a timeline for the change of the administrative structure and to have everything done officially to move forward. So I would just sum up to say that this is very much a collaborative effort. I know I've mentioned historical significance more often this evening than I should have, but believe me, it's not every day that you have 6 governments coming together and reaching consensus on such a major service provision as police and fire communications. And that did happen 6 years ago, and it's happening again as we speak. So I think that is significant. If there are other questions any of you have, we'd be more than happy to address them.
Other questions? Oh, Chair Dalton, do you have any other business?
No, just have to have a motion for adjournment.
Second.
All those in favor?
Well, being no further business, I declare our city council section closed and adjourned. So thank you all very much for coming. Appreciate our visitors' detailed explanation. Thanks.
See you next Wednesday.
Which one's? Oh yeah, probably. You're not taking off to your Maui trip yet.
No, that's wild.
That's wild.
I'm going to Paris first.
Oh, great.
It's end of May, 1st of June.
Oh, that sounds good. We're going to 1st of June. We're supposed to go to Alaska. All right, let's call the study session of the Lakewood City Council for Monday, April 8th to order. As a point of personal privilege, I'd like to mention not only is this the final game of March Madness, it's my wife's birthday, so I might have to go home really late.
Tonight's the last game.
What?
Tonight's the last game.
Yeah.
Lost track after Gonzaga.
Well, Oregon made it Sweet 16, then I lost after that. So the first item of business is a review of the Shoreline Master Plan Program with Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Tiffany Spear, Special Projects Manager for Community and Economic Development Department. So this evening we're going to be walking through, there's two items that you would eventually be taking action on, one of which is a periodic review of the Shoreline Master Program, which was last adopted in, or updated in 2014. And then there's a separate document and a separate action that would be considered by council to adopt a restoration plan. The restoration plan was also developed in 2013, 2014, but it was not adopted at the time. So this is something that the council would be taking up as a new document in a couple of meetings. Get the right thing in my hand. So what is a periodic review as opposed to a full-blown update? This is a technical review. It is meant to be briefer and higher level and more technical than substantive in nature. There is a checklist that the Department of Ecology puts out as guidance for the process that local governments undergo. One thing, though, that also happened with this process for us here in the city of Lakewood is we went a step beyond that and engaged with stakeholders in order to find out, gather their input regarding the shoreline restoration plan, which, as I mentioned, hadn't been adopted prior. So within the periodic review, it's just looking simply, first of all, at statutory and regulatory changes at the state level. So if the Shoreline Management Act and then the ecology guidelines for that act have been updated, making sure that the Shoreline Master Program here in Lakewood is consistent with those changes. And then if there's any changes internally within Lakewood's documents, so the Critical Areas Ordinance regulations, for instance, which were adopted in 2015 here in Lakewood, and then any other development code or other environmental review changes that would have occurred since the last time the SMP was touched. There is not a requirement as part of the periodic review to comprehensively revise the shoreline inventory or characterization reports or restoration plans, which were done in 2013-14. So it's state law that's requiring this, RCW 9058-080 and then WAC 173-26090. Going forward from this periodic review, which is what all jurisdictions across the state are being asked to do this year and next year, going forward from there, every 8 years, the city will be requested to do a comprehensive review of its SMP. So once we get done here in 2019, 2027 would be the next time this document would come before the council for a comprehensive review. What does the what does the Shoreline Master Program apply to, or what does it have jurisdiction over? It is lakes greater than 20 acres in size, streams with a flow greater than 20 cubic feet per second, and shorelands up to 200 feet beyond the ordinary high water mark for these water bodies, and then the associated wetlands with creeks or streams. So within the city of Lakewood, you would see American Lake, Gravelly Lake, Lake Steilacoom, Wahop Lake, Lake Louise, Chambers Creek, Clover Creek, and then its associated wetlands are covered by this Shoreline Master Program, and Steilacoom Creek as well, because it flows into Chambers Creek, which is a regulated water body. And if we just spend a couple of minutes here on this map, you'll see it's color-coded, and on the top is Chambers Creek, and you'll see the red. That is because it's the most pristine categorization. It's considered natural. Then you'll see the yellow coming south down into the city, and that's what Steilacoom Creek is as well. That's conservancy, kind of the next level. The olive green, which is around most of the lakes, is shoreline, I'm gonna get the name wrong. It's the most common one. It does have protections, but it does anticipate public access, and that's what those red X's are around the lakes. And then the purple is Clover Creek, and that is considered an urban stream within the SMP, and so it has a slightly different level of regulation than, say, the red of Chambers Creek. So what has happened up to this point?
Mr. Branstetter.
Yes.
You're on borrowed time.
So what is the difference between Stillicum Creek and Flat Creek that both flow into Chambers Creek?
I cannot give you a clear answer other than when this was done in 2014, Ecology felt that Flat Creek was not something to be regulated under the Shoreline Master Program, but Stillicum Creek was.
Because I can see when we talk about associated wetlands with Chambers Creek, the wetlands that cover much of the Flat Creek basin, you know, and we've actually, as a city, we consider those wetlands as part of our critical area type things. But we don't establish the actual guidelines regarding setbacks and things like that from them within the Shoreline Management Program. You know, and there's a creek, and then there's the water that flows in, the headwaters of a creek that seem to be there. You know, and I don't know, obviously we didn't do that the last time the council did it. They didn't include that particular group of wetlands in that particular creek, which originally is from Ward's Lake, actually. But is that more of an issue for when the next periodic comprehensive update of it is, rather than a technical update?
Yes, sir. Yeah. The intention for this update process per Department of Ecology is to keep it pretty high level and kind of a Scrivener's error almost update. It's the comprehensive update the next time, which would be in 2027, where those types of changes would be looked for. Okay. So outreach efforts on this process, last November actually, there were mailings sent out to all of the property owners adjacent to the water bodies regulated under the Shoreline Master Program in Lakewood, which constituted over 1,220 property owners. There were a Facebook page, City of Lakewood information, as well as the Lakewood Shoreline Master Program website, all of which have had information again since last November. And the smp.org site is the one that has the most up-to-date information, not only the draft documents, but also upcoming dates for decisions to be made now by the council. There have been 2 open houses held this year, January 16th and then February 20th. At the first open house, we had over 35 people show, and there was a lot of interest, I think, based on the mailing that occurred. And once people saw what was happening and the fact that it was a periodic review rather than the more comprehensive update, we had 3 maybe that came to the February 20th open house. So we answered their questions in January, apparently. And then there's also been extensive correspondence and in-person meetings with representatives from the Chambers Clover Creek Watershed Council and the Tahoma Audubon Society. They in particular had an interest in the restoration plan update that occurred at the same time.
To the best of your recollection, did you have any significant public comment or participation for those involved or concerned with Wahop Lake?
No. No.
Interesting.
No. Oops, sorry, and I'm just trying to go back. Wahop Lake is considered urban park environment, and so that's going to have certain allowed uses and levels of protection, but no, we didn't get any from that. It was much more concerns about what can happen in the creek right near my property type of stuff.
Certainly, but
yeah.
The restoration plan components for that lake are also found in this document, as it would be for the other lakes.
Correct, correct. So on March 20th, the Planning Commission took action on both items. They adopted the periodic review amendments. And then they also recommended adoption of the 2019 Shoreline Restoration Plan, which did have a number of amendments back from the 2014 version. And that included updates to, again, look at Lakewood's municipal code as well as state law changes that may have occurred, but it also incorporated a number of changes based on the input from Chambers Clover Creek Watershed and Tahoma Audubon Society members, who brought with them amendments not only about what habitat restoration activities have occurred since the last draft of that plan, but also suggested changes going forward, and in particular, a request that will be coming to you for decision also on your action evening about allowing the Planning Commission to actually dedicate one meeting per year to discuss specifically Shoreline Master Program restoration activities and what have occurred over the last year, and then if there's any updates that would need to be incorporated into the restoration plan as appropriate. So these couple of slides, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but this is the checklist that the Department of Ecology puts out. And long story short, on the left-hand side, it's got in chronological order the changes made in either the WACs, the state regulations, or the state statutes since the last time Lakewood updated or adopted a Shoreline Master Program. The middle column shows how the city of Lakewood took a look at those changes at the state level and verified whether or not changes needed to be made within the current Shoreline Master Program here. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see those changes that were specifically made in various sections of the Shoreline Master Program. So there were a number that were done, but many of them are things like cost thresholds. So if you look up at the top row on this one, the Shoreline Master Program is amended right now to include that the replacement and freshwater dock thresholds to require a substantial development permit, the values went up by so many thousands of dollars in order to be consistent with what's in Washington Administrative Code. So it's those types of changes rather than designating a whole new water body or taking one away or talking about other more substantive amendments. The second big piece of action that's being brought before you for the next couple of meetings is the Shoreline Restoration Plan. And within this are non-regulatory policies and programs that would help restore ecological function for Lakewood's shorelines. The Shoreline Management Program is really to look at a project from here going forward, not degrading shorelines anymore, keeping them as they are. The Restoration Plan, as the name implies, takes it a step further and says, not only are we going to maintain, but we're going to improve over time. And this is, as I mentioned, non-regulatory. It is incorporating opportunities for coordination with property owners as well as groups that are interested in doing this type of work. And it's something that can be handled separately and apart from your Shoreline Master Program. And this, again, is where a lot of effort was spent this year with some consultants as well as with groups in the area that are very interested in these activities. So within the restoration plan, there's an inventory and characterization summary. The big inventory and characterization last happened in 2013-14, just to say, these are your shorelines, City of Lakewood, this is what they look like right now, and this is the shoreline category that we're gonna put them in. Then there are 8 restoration policies that apply system-wide, and then 12 more that are targeted to specific water bodies. And then there's the list of projects and programs, either existing or future, and then some additional potentials. There's looking at targets and monitoring methods and constraints and priorities. So there was also the very last item there, definitions. This was a chapter that was added this year at the request of the folks involved at the Planning Commission level, just to clarify words that may be used either only in this document or maybe in the Shoreline Master Program in this document. And then this is the request that came forward from the Planning Commission as well. This would be an annual meeting going forward where representatives once more of Chambers Clover Creek Watershed, Tahoma Audubon, Pierce Conservation District, and maybe others would bring information to the Planning Commission, and any member of the public that would want to be participating would be welcome to as well, to talk about what's been accomplished or planned over the last year, and does that warrant an amendment to the restoration plan itself. And the idea being, we don't want to be in a position 8 years from now of picking up the restoration plan again and seeing that it's completely obsolete. We want to try to keep that up to date, in part because what happens is those organizations that are seeking grants for projects that they may undertaking themselves or providing dollars for private property owners, to be able to point to a restoration plan, look, this is a priority for the city of Lakewood, or this is a priority in this time frame, it's actually in the document, will be helpful in securing those grant funds. So again, the Planning Commission hears this information and then they decide if there's any actual formal amendment needed to the restoration plan on an annual basis. Those would be brought forward to the council if there were any. And then over time, if this became something that either needed to grow or change or go away, that would just happen kind of on a learning curve as these annual meetings happened. So what we're doing is this periodic review process. There's a checklist looking at a scoping comment period which did occur. Amendments were designated. There was legislative action at the Planning Commission level, and now it's coming to you to adopt amendments. Once that is complete, this is a document, if you'll recall, that needs approval as well from the Department of Ecology. So you'll take action and then it will be forwarded to them for final review. And this is the schedule for that. There's tonight, next week is a public hearing, and then should the council be ready, action would happen on April 22nd. And then moving on from there through June 30th would be when Department of Ecology would review the documents and determine if they are acceptable. And they have been very involved from the beginning. They know what all the different public outreach steps have been. They have seen every iteration of both of these documents, and so it's not like this will be a surprise. So any questions, Mr. Mayor?
Questions? Mr. Whalen?
Just a couple of questions. I'm looking, for example, at page 22 of the packet.
Okay.
And I noted for the, shouldn't say the first time, but I noted that you made a change indicating, just kind of thrown in there, the Lake Steilacoom as shorelines of statewide significance for the statute. I always thought it did. And then later in the document, in the middle section, it doesn't really talk about it consistently, but at the end it does. What was the impact of that inclusion here?
This is just
stating the obvious?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know why it was just kind of stuck there, because there are others that have shorelines of statewide significance among the list in the prior paragraph. I don't know why it's just kind
These are, they're not shorelines of statewide significance, they are SMP regulated water bodies. The only shorelines of statewide significance are on Lake Steilacoom.
Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
All right, well, that's good to know. And what makes the differentiation?
If I could find the definition for you really quick. I think it's the size, but there's other criteria as well, because you do have other water bodies that are at least as big as Lake Steilacoom. Okay. If you give me just a minute, I can find it. I'm sorry? Correct.
That surprises me.
Steilacoom flows into Chambers Bay.
That may be, yeah.
That could be part of it. You know, just anecdotally looking at the shoreline restoration plans, as you may know, if you were here for any number of meetings, we've been beat up a bit about the WAHOP plan. And this document, interestingly enough, really kind of disfavors the concept of dredging and raises, you know, any number of concerns about dredging within the lakes subject to the shoreline master program. And again, no one mentioned anything. There wasn't a bum's rush to include provisions in this document with regard to restoration of WAHOP any different than we already did on the WAHOP restoration plan that we created, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. So.
And those on WAHOP Lake were provided the same public notice as everyone who were there. So
it's very interesting here because it's pretty implicit about why dredging doesn't make sense for any number of good reasons in this particular document.
Mr. Bolke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So a couple of questions. Chambers, it breaks up Chambers Creek into a number of segments. So I'm happy to see that in the first let's start with Clover Creek. First of all, I'm happy to see that we are, you know, recognizing that there has some work occurred. It had a picture of Councilmember Branstetter sitting there pulling weeds a couple of years ago in Springbrook Park, and we're working on that portion, but let's go down below. Chambers Creek and the canyon, which is considered to be the best segments, yet that's where we're putting the trail. So is the trail going to help, or we're going to improve the trails? Is the trail going to improve access for people to get down there and pull out the invasive species and put in native species, or is the trail going to hurt those efforts?
The trail, as far as I know, and I have only been very tangentially involved with that, is not intended to increase access to Chambers Creek. It is maybe parallel to it, but the idea is this is pristine and the intent is to keep it that way. And the same holds true in University Place's SMP.
So I went on the tour and got the t-shirt. Climbed in there. The concept in Chambers is to have more of a boardwalk elevated arrangement up higher on the grade above the creek, so that you view the creek from above, but you're, for the most part, not walking on creating erosion. And there's also some discussion regarding the existing armoring on the side of the creek, although at the time I was there, there wasn't really any analysis that had taken place with respect to what that would mean to, for example, the little parking area across from the Oak Brook.
Right.
If you take the arming out of the creek, is that going to endanger that slope back there where across from Oak Brook Country Club Golf Course or parking? But the idea is that it isn't going to bring people to the creek. It's going to bring them into the area and provide access for safety and for maintaining the area in a more ecologically sensitive manner.
Okay, so it should actually help. We're hoping
the idea is that it helps.
Easier to access.
Mr. Buer.
There's an example of that in the wetland area just adjacent to Bellevue, where they have taken and created these boardwalks through a wetland. It's under I-90. If you've never been there before, it's very interesting. But that's an example of what is proposed. There's other things being proposed for Chambers Creek, including at some point in time, removal of the dam. We've had some discussions about that, some very conceptual discussions. There's a lot of issues that go with that, but more to follow. At this point, Chambers Creek is kind of special and a little bit unique from the other creeks in Lakewood this time.
And the county has a grant request in that's going to go in front of the council on it for big expensive thing to replace the bridge.
Well, the grant request is to get in line for other people's money for bridge replacement, but probably wouldn't be enough. So actually committing to that is a whole different issue. And so the executive approved the application for the grant, but not actually the commitment to spend the money. And one of the issues there is that if you take the dam out, the existing substandard bridge is endangered from tidal erosion. It isn't. The tidal waters would go back past the existing bridge and create back up the estuary if it's restored, and that tidal action would have a very negative impact on the structure of the existing bridge. So then the question is, how big a bridge do you build, and does UP really own half of it and the county half of it, or does it all belong to the county? And the good news is Lakewood has no chance of owning half of that bridge, because at that point, the south side of the creek is clearly unincorporated Pierce County. It's not till farther up that Lakewood comes down to the creek.
Because I think the local match is a couple million, right? $2 or $3 million.
Yeah, it's the idea that it was $3 million, assuming it would be a $3 million match to $12 million grant, assuming $15 million would rebuild that bridge. And I've seen some of the numbers on the possibility of rebuilding a Fox Island Bridge, and I don't think $15 million would be close.
So I got a couple other questions then. The public meetings.
Yes.
You mentioned that a lot of people showed up because I think they were worried that we were redoing the shorelines, doing another update. But cutting through that, what other information did you glean from those, at least the first meeting?
There was a lot of interest in stream activity and whether or not large woody debris should be left in streams. Because from somebody looking at their backyard, they may not want that. They may not like the backing up of the water. They may not like what it looks like. But per environmental and shoreline protection activities and habitat protection activities, that's actually a preferred thing to do. So there's some friction there, and public education would certainly help. And I think some of the things that, for instance, the Audubon Society has started doing in the city of Lakewood will help over time. But that was the biggest complaint, if you will, was people were saying, how come this stuff how come I can't just go down there and pull that out?
So the Clover Creek, so we're working on our side at least a little bit on the areas that we own. And I guess we're talking to some of the landowners. And then they mentioned that somewhere along the way there were blockages of some group went in and actually had to take out because there were blockages on that.
Are you referring to the culvert that was removed?
Yeah, or something like that.
I don't know, Mr. Beer, if you...
There's something written in here where there was actually stuff needed to be removed. But that's really not my question. I guess, well, sorry. First of all, I'm wondering why we had those, you know, were people just putting in these barriers on their own and we weren't finding them. But the other thing is there still a dam out on the base?
My understanding, there's no dam at the base, but the culverts underneath the runways act to slow down the movement of water into Lakewood. Because when the water is flowing, the culverts are not sized enough to get all the water into Lakewood, which then gets into questions of whether or not we really have floodplain issues along Clover Creek, which is something that we're looking at right now.
Okay. And any reaction from the Air Force on?
None at this point. The other thing that I would also say that the blockages that I'm familiar with was in a major storm event, 96, 97, when a lot of debris got caught in the culverts underneath I-5 between Springbrook and Clover Creek. That is the only blockage of material that I'm aware of. And that caused a flooding situation.
And are those adequately sized?
For most activity, but then again, if the culverts underneath the runway are keeping the water down, then the culverts underneath I-5 aren't a problem unless you have blockages of debris. I'm no hydrologist, it's just been here a while, so that I've seen events in the past.
Okay, and then there was mentions of us putting in sewers and whatnot as one of the things that we're doing to try to help water quality. Is there evidence that there's failing septic tank systems in areas near bodies of water?
To get that it's been difficult to get that information from the health department. I would assume that some of the lot sizes in Tillicum that are proximate to American Lake, given that they've been there for so long, that there are probably some problems with septic tanks and the systems that are there. We've also had issues with septic tanks and the lines that run from them going across multiple property owners or people connecting to septic tanks that don't belong to them. So there's all these kinds of things that are out there as we get closer and closer to American Lake. And with some of our abatement projects right now, we're cleaning the properties up, the properties are redeveloping, and we're beginning to see some of the expansions of the lines closer and closer to the water. So over time, we are beginning to address this to some extent, but it's going to take time as we go through this.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Spear?
I'm finished if there's no other questions.
Mr. Branstetter?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do think that the fact that we are looking at more substantially and trying to make a restoration plan more of a living document and of a process is very consistent with the vision that we adopted of where we want Lakewood particularly to be known for its lakes and open spaces and water, to be able to go and do that. I think there are a couple of things in the initial 2019 restoration plan, which is supposed to be a combination of projects and programs. And I think that, you know, over the next year, we should really look at developing within the city a program that's not unlike where we recognize businesses or where we recognize other groups, but develop a thing of where we recognize private property owners that make significant shoreline restoration type actions going on, and we sort of come up with a way to at least recognize the most significant one or a number of significant ones to be able to go and do that, because the improvements to the shoreline impact the quality of life in the city, surprisingly, not just for people, but for others to be able to go and do that. So, you know, I would look of, say, encouraging us to adopt the shoreline and restoration plan, but then keep it alive, and look at how we can think about good ideas to put into it, because most of the shoreline, the vast majority of the shoreline, is in the hands of private property owners. And if we, you know, so if we're going to have any success there, it isn't a question of what do we do in our parks where we have shorelines. It's a question of how do we create a situation of where the lake associations and individual private property owners on the creeks and lakes do things that are consistent with that. And because all too often we see the other examples of people who kind of just would like their shoreline to be more a place to entertain, and they harden it and they do some things. You know, we just recently have the situation that has evolved along Phillips Road on Chambers Creek, of where just someone decided, well, there's just too much creek here and I need to fill it in and I need a patio and some things over there, and now we're trying to figure out how do you get that undone, or what can you do? That's the opposite of restoration, you know, and this is the shoreline management program is our tool, you know, is our enforcement tool, particularly in the hands of the hearing examiner and the community development department, along with the different state agencies, you know, to exercise appropriate stewardship of all these shorelines. I understand that this is not a comprehensive review, but that I am concerned about the last 3 pages of the shoreline management program. And I'm actually looking at, in our packet, at page 211, which is page 48 of the program. And it's a list of references that have been there for a long time that I assume are informing the kinds of things that we put into this. And some of these look to be outdated, or in some cases debunked, to be able to go and do that. I mean, I'm not sure why our plan still has the references, the priorities for 2007 through 2011. I'm not quite sure why we have the Guahop Lake calcium hydroxide study as a reference. You know, I think that we could look at what's in the plan and are these references actually informing the plan? And if they're not give them the credibility that if we've no longer seeing them as credible, and just paring down the references, as well as there are some things that we have perhaps done over the past 8 years, such as the references of Brown and Caldwell study and some things over there, that there may be just some references that we want to mention that don't necessarily mean we have to change any verbiage or anything earlier in the plan. But if this is intended to be a list of the documents that we feel credibly inform our view, you know, an edit to that. And then on 212, there's Appendix A of the plan. And this is a 20-year-old resolution passed by the then City Council recommending an action that was relevant back then to some federal commission, and I just cannot track how it has any relevance today, and simply deleting Appendix A would just be not a comprehensive change, but help with cleaning it up.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to just comment to my colleagues' comments about the references. Now, I look at references as sources. Even if the reference isn't good, you can still learn something from it. And let's take something I'm a lot more familiar with, and that's history. If I'm required to do a study on someone, good, bad, or ugly, I have to do a review of the literature, good, bad, and ugly. You take out some of these references, Mike, and you are taking out some of the record, good, bad, or ugly. My point is, it's there. Whether someone in the future chooses to use it or not in any kind of research is up to them. But I do not think that it's good practice from an intellectual point of view to begin to remove references that could and may still serve as points of departure. So I agree with you on your second point about the past city council action, but on the references, no, sir, I respectfully disagree.
Well, if I would agree with your point,
then you would be wiser.
The idea would be, though, then you should, as you begin to make decisions based on new references, you should add references.
Exactly, and Mike, I have no problem with the adding. It's the taking away from the basis, because we can learn from every single reference, whether it's not to do something or to do something or to wait on something. But I see your point. If you're good with that, I'm good with leaving these references.
But you list one, you give it weight. If you have others that you don't list, but then you find out, so they should all be there.
Mr. Mayor, if I could respond.
Yes.
Just quickly, the references that are included were those that were at least accurate at the time of the 2013-2014 drafting of the restoration plan. There's no suggested changes in this version as of now, but these were, to the extent when it was drafted, accurate and used in some way in the development of the restoration plan. I can certainly be looking at anything that's come online since that should be added, and I would have that ready for the council at the next time you take a look at the document. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good idea. Do you have more? Mr. Buer?
We're ready to move on, Mr. Mayor.
Move on. Thank you much. We'll Call up Mr. Adamson to give us a review of the 2019 SSMCP work plan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. Quick 10 slides, and we can watch the end of the championship, I guess. No, it's over? Okay. So as this council knows, when there are issues that affect both civilian and military populations in the South Sound, it's SSMCP's mission to be the conduit for trusted solutions to those issues and to educate all the public about the crucial importance of maintaining a vital and strong Joint Base Lewis-McChord. SSMCP's job is to achieve outcomes that ensure that military service members will continue to be a stable part of the regional economy. So I know you know what we do, but I wanted to put this up here because the three that are bolded in the middle there, I think all had regional, maybe statewide impact this past year with the completion of that economic impact analysis, which I will mention that we are getting ready to do another one, which the problem statement is going to change. The last one was focused solely on the JBLM workforce, so it neglected to take into account military families, military working spouses, military retirees, the 25,000 spin-off jobs, civilian spin-off jobs that are part of the local community. And potentially we can take a look at veterans, especially transitioning service members that choose to stay in the South Sound once they transition out. So there's a number of things that we're going to look at. I think I've already briefed council on that and the workforce survey, and we'll touch on some legislative advocacy that's happening right now. So just a quick review of 2018. We've expanded our membership to 56 organizations. We secured a number of mid and long-term funding sources. Importantly, the OEA grant for $500,000, the $550K from the state legislature to look at our continuation of the I-5 congestion relief project, but this time from exit 116 Mounts Road down to exit 99 in Tumwater. And then the $2 million grant we got from the state in 2018 for the North Clear Zone. That is very important. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We've completed 8 of the original 22 strategies from the 2015 JLUS, and we continue to work on 3 more now. I'll give you a quick update on those. And then we did these other surveys and the analysis. Here's the work plan that was actually approved back last fall at our November Elected Officials Council. Just quickly to review, I briefed this council on the results of the JBLM land exchange plan. The lighting study is coming to completion the end of this month. And one of the key deliverables out of that is a regional lighting code and a template for local jurisdictions to choose, if they choose to adopt it, to adjust their lighting procedures to be more conducive with military flight operations in most cases. Tasks 2 and 3 will, the clear zone issue we'll talk about more, and we'll talk more about the Tumwater to Mouse Road. Sort of tasks 4, 5, and 7 are, or 4, 5, and 6 are our day-to-day business. We have, and task 8, and I'll get into the advocacy, legislative advocacy more in just a minute. So we did a membership survey just a couple months ago, and the genesis of this was, you might recall me talking about a strategic vision document for SSMCP. It's been operating under biennial work plan since its inception, so it doesn't have a long-term document guiding it. And so what we wanted to check with our membership is, what did they value out of their relationship with SSMCP, and what does SSMCP achieve for them? And so on this first slide, you see a bunch of percentages, and the one I'm going to concentrate on is the bottom one because it's the smallest. But as it turns out, legislative advocacy is the most impactful according to the people who took our survey. Where only 2.7% of survey respondents had anything to do with legislative advocacy, almost 54% thought it was the most important thing that we do. So we are gonna continue to emphasize that and our relationship with our contracted consultant, which is she's doing great work for us here.
Can I ask a question?
Sir.
What was your number on your sample? How many participated in the survey?
Actual responses were 114 out of 700 that were sent out. So one of the questions we asked was, what do we need to do to become a self-sufficient organization? As you know, we exist based on membership dues and OEA grants. This next OEA grant that we're applying for is going to be our final OEA grant based on the findings of the 2015 JLUS. We've been told that by OEA. So when we complete that grant in mid-2020, that funding source will no longer be available to us unless at some point in the near future we go out and do another joint land use study. So the vast majority of the SSMCP members that responded to the survey think we need to increase corporate and business involvement. And I didn't point it out on the very first slide, but our biggest corporate partner on our logo chart is now a steering committee member, is Puget Sound Energy. So that's a big add for us as an organization, but we're going to continue to go out, and we could use council's help in approaching local business especially and becoming members of SSMCP. Some of the key comments in the narrative, I'm just going to highlight the bottom one, because this is from an SSMCP member, unsure of what SSMCP does, but after Googling was impressed. So one of the legislative advocacy actions we took on was done in collaboration with a number of other of our partners. The Shared Legislative Agenda Team out of Thurston County, which includes Olympia, Tumwater, Lacey, and a number of organizations like TRPC, and then the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Pierce County. This is a project that is taking a look at the 17-mile stretch of road from exit 116 down to 99. I'm happy to report that this project was fully funded in the House budget at $4.5 million to do a NEPA-SEPA analysis. However, it was unfunded in the Senate version of the budget, but no project was funded in the Senate version of the budget, and they are still in negotiations between the House and the Senate to see if there's going to be some way to get any level of funding in for that particular project. And in the blue box, you can see the kinds of things it was going to accomplish. Importantly, if we ever got to the point where we're going to do work, the initial work will be done in Pierce County at those railroad overpasses that lead down, if you're heading south, to the Nisqually River Bridge. Then the project that's near and dear to us, the North Clear Zone. We've made a number of accomplishments, from the appraisals to developing an implementation plan, had a 5-party multi-jurisdictional memorandum of agreement signed. We're starting to see money come in from the state. We've actually spent $1.17 million acquiring 2 properties last year. We have the promise, verbal commitment from 2 sources of the federal government, the REPI program, which is Readiness Environmental Protection Integration Program, and the U.S. Air Force, tune of $1.5 million apiece. And we had submitted a $3 million ask to the state capital budget this year, with commitments from the feds and the $3 million from the state capital budget. We would have been able to buy the Tactical Taylor building, which is our highest priority because of the risk to public safety that facility could cause if a plane goes down. However, the House and the Senate did not fund our ask of $3 million. So the fallback position has become that Senator Conway and Senator O'Ban will, on the open Senate floor, propose an amendment to ask for $1.5 million for this capital budget year. We don't know exactly when that open floor debate will occur, but as of earlier this afternoon, it still hadn't been scheduled. And then we also took a look at the JBLM land exchange area.
On that, the Senate Republicans are holding a bond issuance that the Senate Democrats and House Democrats want hostage. And speculation is that part of a trade-off for approving, because they need 60 votes for the bond, and they don't have them. And part of the trade-off for that bond may be Senate Republicans having a greater say in where the capital budget allocations go, which in two ways could be good for Lakewood. One is that Senator O'Ban's capital budget requests are better for Lakewood than the House House members' budget requests for Lakewood. And the second one is it gives a greater chance of this to slip in. So, but that's all sausage that hasn't been made yet.
Last thing here on what's next. Several of us met with Pierce County and the city stakeholders several months ago on the possibility that now that Pierce County is the majority condo owner in the condo association, is there some way that Pierce County can dissolve the condo association rules and through its majority stake just basically tell the other owners that they're going to have to sell their condos and we can acquire property that way. That is under legal review. Those are the seven, I can't, it's the, on the left-hand side, the blue shaded, I think it's 5, but my eyes aren't that good.
By the, on your way to the vehicle inspection station, they're on the right.
Yeah, there's 47 of those. The county owns 32, I think. And there's like 15 or 16 that are still out there in private ownership.
They're worth about $60,000 a piece. They're huge. I mean, you could put a shop in them and drive a truck in. I mean, they're big. They're commercial.
So those were our two legislative asks, but SSMCP also had a policy position that's still working its way through the legislature. Senator Conway submitted Senate Bill 5748, which was to create a defense community infrastructure account at the state level. That sailed through the Senate side and is now over at the House. We had to negotiate some amended language to get it into the House, but last Friday it was voted out of the House and now is in the Rules Committee. So it's in the final stage, I think, now. So we'd have a Senate and House version that are compatible, and it would have to come out of, I think, full Senate floor vote some point in the near future. That's an important account because that allows the state to prioritize local jurisdiction projects that were developed in collaboration with their military installation, and then provide the 20% matching funds that are going to be required when the federal Defense Community Infrastructure Program receives funding. Congressman Heck is out right now writing letters to his colleagues that that should be funded at $100 million. The hopes is that it will. The office that may manage that for DOD is the Office of Economic Adjustment, who we have a very good relationship with. We submitted 2 projects through the Association of Defense Communities apparatus that are back there now lobbying for different things associated with the DCEP program. Last slide is what's coming up for our final OEA grant. We've submitted this to OEA. The ask is for $559,000. About 55,000 would be matching funds. The 3 tasks that you see here are the final 3 tasks we need to accomplish from the 2015 JLUS. The first one is focused on the local transportation network in the vicinity of JBLM. And we are using a study area, a 5-mile contour around the perimeter of JBLM. The project goal is to develop a plan that can be approved and adopted by local entities that identifies the capacity, operational and safety issues, and results in a list of prioritized projects that address the goals of this plan. Improve access to JBLM. That is becoming a readiness issue when things like a high-speed train fall off and you shut down the highway for a couple of days. The second one on conservation banking and conservation partnering is specific to Thurston County and was identified back in the 2015 JLUS. The project goal here is to reduce listed species encroachment on JBLM by identifying ways to support and encourage conservation actions off-post. Unknown to me when I started to look into this, but JBLM has negotiated voluntary restrictions on its training with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So these endangered species are impacting currently JBLM training and operations. And the last project here has to do with adequate housing for service members. And the goal here is to identify opportunities for collaboration and potential barriers to active duty service members to access adequate, affordable housing near JBLM. With the economic growth in the South Sound and the increasing rental rates going up, some of our lower enlisted families, I'm not talking about guys that can still live in the barracks, but an E4 with a family of 4 basically can't afford to live around here anymore. It's getting very tight, and so that's what this is designed to take a look at. So with that, I'll stand by for questions.
Questions from Mr. Adamson? I heard that there was a cutoff on Mr. Heck's letter for additional signatories, so it's being transmitted.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll probably hear more about that at the Elected Officials Council on 16 May because he's doing a video for us again.
One of the interesting things about that was it was, though not a, I got this back from, although my effort to become gain a nomination for the ADC board is met with crickets. I mean, they haven't announced what they've done, and it's been a month. They have to do that by June. I have been appointed to the Federal Outreach and Advocacy Committee, which includes some significantly connected lobbyists in D.C. Mr. Heck's letter went in, or is going in. Congressman Kilmer was not, although he's a great proponent of it, he wasn't kind of included in that initially, and he's an appropriator, but that's good. And Congressman Smith is not on the letter, but he's an advocate, so, and he's the chair. So if it can get a little bit of traction, it's got some friends in high places, so we'll see. The other, that's the good news. The bad news is over $100 million worth of potential money there. That's kind of the cap on what would be proposed this year, and there's $1 billion worth of listed projects that people are lining up for. Literally, it's 10 to 1. Shows the need. Anything else for Mr. Adamson? Then thank you very much, and we will move to reports by the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. First, I'd like to call up Mr. Buer and Ms. Spear to provide the City Council with a a review of a draft letter that has been prepared, and this is in response to PSRC's Vision 2050 SEIS. I think as the council's aware, the comment period concludes on April 29th. The draft letter before you is for two purposes. One, for this to go directly to PSRC with the city of Lakewood, but also to send a version of this to Pierce County, specifically the executive's office, who is coordinating and will be developing a regional response from Pierce County, any and all cities and towns from Pierce County that want to participate, as well as cities and towns in the county from Kitsap and Snohomish County. It is 17 pages long. It's fresh off the presses. We were working on it, actually, sorry, Dave and Tiffany were working on it all day today. And what we'd like to do is try and get it finalized by the end of this week or early next week to send it off to those respective agencies. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Buer and Ms. Spear. Actually, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Manager.
Can we start with bullet points instead of a recitation of page by page,
Absolutely.
please?
What we're actually going to begin with is a PowerPoint, which isn't text out of the letter. So if you recall, when we were here about a month ago, there was the conversation that the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement, or SEIS, for Vision 2050 provides analysis of 3 growth alternatives for the region. And the region is Pierce, Kitsap, King, and Snohomish counties. The first is called Stay the Course, and that is the no action alternative within the environmental analysis, meaning Vision 2040 moves forward another 10 years without any changes to policy or strategy. Transit-focused growth is a request or a directive to move up to 75% of growth for housing and jobs to areas with high-capacity transit. And then reset urban growth is almost, I won't call it 180 degrees different, but the idea there is to, instead of focusing things in the metro cities, the largest cities, and then along high-capacity transit corridors, this is looking at distribution of both housing and jobs in a more equitable way, meaning an equal amount to various jurisdictions throughout the 4 counties and their cities. So on the top here of this slide, you'll see just a very high-level summary of what each one of those would be. Stay the course, compact growth in the metropolitan and core cities, and if you recall, metropolitan would basically be Everett, Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma. Core cities include the city of Lakewood for Pierce County. And this is, again, moving forward basically 10 years with the current policies. Transit focused is the high growth is along those high capacity transit areas, which include, if you look at that little subsection of red text down almost to the bottom there, is light rail, bus rapid transit, commuter rail, ferries, and streetcar areas. And the idea, again, is to take 75% of growth and putting it in those areas in the future. Reset urban growth looks at the actual growth that occurred in the years 2000 to 2016 and kind of uses that as a basis and then says, continuing those same types of patterns, this is where growth would go. So this is it in numbers. I'll show this graphically in just a second, but broken out, you'll see there's slightly different percentages assigned through each of those options for both population and employment. Here it is the population. The orange are the metro cities. The gray is core. Turquoise is the high capacity transit. Dark gray is the city and towns. Light green, urban unincorporated area, and purple is the rural. So if you were to look at, for instance, the light gray, so this is what would apply to the city of Lakewood. If things were to go forward unchanged under Stay the Course, 28% of the growth for the next however many years through 2050 would come into those core cities. And so Pierce County's total share of growth would be, part of that 28% would be coming to the city of Lakewood. If you were to switch to transit-focused growth, the share for Lakewood would move from 28 to 29%. And then if you were to do reset urban growth, that would be a 25%, so a 3% drop from Stay the Course, or 4% less than what the transit-focused growth would do. Probably the biggest difference is if you were to look both at the high-capacity transit communities, the turquoise, and then the dark gray, the dark gray. In the turquoise, that's both within cities as well as out in unincorporated areas, wherever those high-capacity corridors are. Between Stay the Course and transit focused, it jumps 5%. Between Stay the Course and reset urban growth, that stays the same. If you look at the dark gray, stay the course for the cities and towns other than those metro and core level ones drops from 9% to 6%, or it just moves down 1% from 9 to 8 if you do the reset urban growth. And then the last one I'll touch on really quickly is the lime green for unincorporated urban, which, as you know, is substantial in Pierce County, at least unless and until some incorporations happen. 5% of the growth under the stay the course, that drops by 1% under high capacity transit. But if you look at reset urban growth, the stay the course more than doubles, because that's looking at the actual growth pattern since 2000 and then projecting that forward. Same idea here, but for employment. And you'll see similar patterns. Between stay the course and reset urban growth, though, you'll see a jump again in that unincorporated county area of doubling from 3 to 6% if they reset urban growth were selected. This is another one that talks about jobs housing balance, and to just hone it down very quickly, number 1 equals there is 1 job for every housing unit in these various geographic areas. If it's less than 1, that means there are more houses there than jobs. If it's more than 1, there's more jobs than houses. And so under stay the course, I'm just gonna look at Pierce County. You see there's about 3/4 of a job to every housing unit. If you were to move to transit focused growth, that would jump to about 80% or 0.8. And then reset urban growth, it goes up even more. So between stay the course and reset urban growth, you see a 5%, for lack of a better word, or a ratio change of 5 of jobs to housing within Pierce County should the reset urban growth one be selected. The process, right now we're in the middle of the time to provide the public comment, which is why we're here with you tonight. And then moving forward from the acceptance of all of those comments through April 29th, there's going to be discussion at the policy board, growth management policy board, about which alternative to direct staff to continue with to finish the full plan draft. And then that draft plan is expected to be released in July or August for review of the actual substantive Vision 2050. So the intent, as Mr. Caulfield mentioned, was to get a letter directly from the city of Lakewood up to PSRC, but also to provide this to that regional coalition that Executive Dammeier has organized. So unless there's any questions on that, I'll jump over to the letter draft itself. We good?
Questions?
Okay. All right. Moving to the letter then, which you all have in hard copy in front of you. The first page just highlights the fact that according to PSRC's original interlocal agreement, the purpose was to deal with growth management as well as transportation in accordance with federal and state law, but then you'll also see in bold text, based on local comprehensive plans of jurisdictions within the region. The intent was to come bottom up. And then this was re-emphasized in the 2009 bylaws. The purpose statement there says, again, it's the authority delegated to it pursuant to the 93 interlocal agreement. So that idea that local comprehensive plans are the basis for the PSRC activities still stands. One point that this letter highlights is that Lakewood is supportive of the major military installations being designated as regional geographies starting in Vision 2050. And then there's discussion on the top of page 2 regarding infrastructure planning and the idea that not only Lakewood, but a number of other cities within PSRC's geography have incorporated since GMA, or since even that PSRC interlocal agreement of 1993. And for many, if not most of these jurisdictions, they sit in a different situation than other older cities because they may contract for some or all of their utilities and public services. The older cities may well have that within their own ownership, but in particular newer cities, but then there are probably a number of others, they contract them out. And so when it comes time to look at policies and regulations even regarding planning over time and do this and don't do that, if the jurisdiction is not in control of those utilities and infrastructure planning, that becomes that much more difficult.
I'm going to interject right here and just add something that Tiffany said that I'd like to emphasize. Under the whole GMA process, the whole planning piece was supposed to be bottoms up, not top down, okay? As you go through these materials this evening, what you may very well see happen in a final product is that these mitigation measures become requirements to your certification of your comprehensive plan. if you would like to have transportation funding in the future. So we're moving from bottoms up to top down. And I want to make sure that this council understands this, because these mitigation measures potentially become countywide planning policies, and thereby that is what impacts local communities. And so I'm very sensitive about this. I want to make sure that I point that out to the council.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Buer. I take your point. In fact, I was going to call you Thomas Jefferson for good reason. You just read us the preamble, and then the rest of this is nothing more than a bill of attainder, which looks remarkably like what 55 men signed, a document written by one Thomas Jefferson. So my question, if you want to cut to the chase, is when do we declare independence from the king to the north of us? No pun intended.
I'll leave that as a political conversation. Well, sorry, go ahead.
I would say it this way. The whole purpose behind working with Pierce County and the other counties is to submit comments on this EIS as a total grouping or as a collaboration. And at that point, see how PSRC reacts. Will PSRC accept them and make amendments to their plan? Will they understand the position of this city and these other counties as they go through this planning process? Or are they going to come back and say, well, the population, the jobs are found in King County. Thank you for playing. We appreciate this. But we like stay the course because it fits our needs. At that point, it becomes a political question that I cannot answer. And so that goes on to a much higher level than me. I'm sure Mr. Mayor may want to say something.
Well, let's just say under state law, it is particularly difficult unless you're willing to forfeit all funding for transportation.
Which begs the question, then why are we having this discussion? Because we're required, and if so, by whom?
We have been asked by the city manager to prepare this.
I know we can do that. But I mean, it seems to me that we're going in a circle here. Because nobody wants to say to King County, I almost said King George III, no, damn it. It's supposed to be from the bottom up, not from the top down. And I would be willing to bet we can look, this isn't going anywhere. They'll listen, they'll be polite, and then they're going to get back up on their horse and they're going to ride roughshod over us for the next, 10 years? Tell me I'm wrong and I'll be quiet.
I'm expecting that when they go through our comments, they will say, quote, unquote, comment duly noted.
So these are in conjunction with comments from others. And I know it's the county executives. It's his idea that we should go forward with one collective, and collective is anything peripheral to this Seattle central hub effort to have some reform before we essentially throw down the gauntlet. So this is part of that effort where say, well, last chance to wake up before we throw a tantrum, which may or may not have any impact.
Plus, he's going to be the chair next year, and it would really look bad for us to someone knows at him.
Although, yeah, I think he'll take this one. Huh? He wouldn't take Pierce Transit, but he will take this one, I think.
He's supposed to be the chair of PSRC next year.
Yeah.
If the General Assembly is going to be voted in, hopefully. I mean, there'd be a weird anomaly if he wasn't, because he's the vice chair now. But if he's voted in, it would be a
But then that
bad
puts
play.
him, and by extension us, in that same catch-22 that you just said. Are you going to make a distinction between the independence of the three counties outside of King or do you run the risk of losing those federal dollars?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm betting that the dollars win because history is very clear on this. When anytime economics and anything comes into collision, economics is going to win. So again, and I'm playing the devil's advocate here, I don't care who you have as a leader of this PCSRC meeting. We are not getting off square one. And you know, I'm looking at Paul now, TCRC isn't going to change.
Yeah,
What?
we can't get out of this if Tacoma blocks it, and Tacoma.
And
why get ourselves overly frustrated?
and we can't form a new one unless the governor approves it, so. But there's another element of the equation here, and that is that, and Mr. Buer and Mr. Caulfield can correct me if they have a different opinion, much of what is going on with PSRC is staff-driven. It's not board-driven. Not only is it from the top down, it's not from the top down purely from an elected, appointed leadership aspect. The top is actually PSRC staff, which has grown tremendously over time, making policy and forcing it through a rubber stamp board. So I know one of Executive Dan Meyer's initiatives is to try to wrest some of the control from the staff-driven aspect of it and put it back where it's transparent and it's voted on. So they have to, basically, they have to insult us to our face instead of behind our back, where it all just keeps coming out of staff.
And if I could just add a couple more things, Councilmember Simpson. First of all, the idea of PSRC and Lakewood's relationship. Lakewood cannot, as an individual city, step away and create its own. It has to be the minimum of the county. And as was mentioned by Councilmember Whalen, if the city of Tacoma doesn't do it, it's a non-starter. And then even if everybody in county did, governor has to agree to it as well. So it's do you play and live with the little tiny victories you might be able to get over time, or do you just walk away from the table and lose everything? And so it's a matter of trying to engage and perhaps play the long game where there can be some improvement as opposed to not.
It's like getting a kernel of rice or not. Either way, Tiffany, you lose and you're controlled by somebody. Now, if you want to live like that, then that's what we're going to do as a city.
It's better to piss inside the tent than outside.
I understand that.
At least try.
I know all that, but it's still, I mean, we talk about what's best for the city of Lakewood and how to improve the quality of life here. There's a big fat target sitting out there. And I do appreciate this. I read this over. This is well done. I mean, I like the fact that you said thank you for your consideration in the first paragraph. Good for you. I hope that was deliberate rather than waiting to the end to say thank you. Thank you.
Well, that was Tiffany's piece.
This is nonsense we're putting up with. I like how you wrote this, but again, I just find myself thinking the wheel just made another revolution. We're still where we are a year ago.
We're not getting rid of PSRC in our lifetime.
I know. Damn it, it feels good to say so.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, I just had one question. A percentage of the comments that we have here are saying there's a proposed mitigation measure that's already exists codified elsewhere. Is that in Vision 2040, were there lots of measures like that? So is this just a continuation of a thing of where something's already codified at the state level or in a county planning policy or something, and they're just borrowing it to put into their document? Is that or is this a change in tactic?
One of the things that you look at when you're looking at an EIS, and I give the council a couple of pointers, is what is the statement of need, the purpose and statement of need, and then go directly to the mitigation measures and see if it all aligns. So what we did was we looked at the purpose and need in the scoping document and then took a look at the mitigation measures and concentrated on those that are most impactful to Lakewood, which is land use, housing, and transportation. Those are the big ones, okay. And many of the existing proposed mitigation measures are almost verbatim in some cases right out of the countywide planning policies. So we took the time to point that out, because it then begs the bigger question. Of the three alternatives, are there really three alternatives, or is this really stay the course? And it appears to me that this is more stay the course. And I wanted to point this out to them, to PSRC staff, to let them know that we know we have read the countywide planning policies and there is no need for additional mitigation measures. It's already in place, at least in Pierce County. I'm not even sure that they have looked at the countywide planning policies for King County or Snohomish or Kitsap. And people don't look at the countywides as the way we do, because we spend time on it. And it's important to do that. So we've taken that time to share with them, you don't need to put in mitigation measures if there's something already in place. So that's why we did it. We're trying to reduce the number of mitigation measures. We're also trying to clarify things. For example, like on infill development, support infill development. Well, what the hell does that mean? I mean, there's a whole lot of components that go with that. So we've actually tried to outline that for them, because they're not doing their homework, to share with them, if you're going to propose infill development, this is exactly what it means. And it means you have to invest in infrastructure where many of the newer cities just don't have. So you can't get the density of the development you desire until you start addressing some of the infrastructure things. So we've tried to spin it back on them.
But let me just say, and I understand you found many of the mitigation measures are already covered in countywide planning policies in Pierce County. How does that transition to saying it's not a good regional requirement in case it's like not included in Snohomish and Kitsap or King? The fact that it's in one county, it would seem that if it's in all counties, that's one thing, but if it's in one and it's a good idea, why would the regional body not adopt it?
That's true. I can see that, but if it's in Pierce County, you know, is the whole purpose of the EIS to bring up these other counties and have the same kinds of policies in place? You know, it's really kind of a moot point for Pierce County and the city of Lakewood at this point. But I'm trying to figure out what is their method here. The other piece is to say that it's not relevant to Lakewood and Pierce County, then remove it from the EIS. So now they're going to have to respond. So they're going to come back and say, well, thank you, City of Lakewood. It's true, it does not relevant, or it's not moot for you in Pierce County, but it is relevant to these other counties. Oh, so there's been inconsistency all along.
You did? Okay.
Okay, so back to
Sorry,
page 2. That's all right. So we get through that initial just overview statements, and then you'll see a couple of items that refer to real-life examples, for instance, in the city of California relating to transit-focused growth, and the fact that the idea of really concentrating 75% of population and employment growth over the next 30 years in such a limited area is unrealistic and has actually a lot of unintended consequences. And then you'll see discussion starting on page 3 of specific mitigation measures. As Mr. Buer was just talking about, a lot of time in this letter is spent on the housing alternatives and mitigation alternatives, there. So that moves you from page 3 over to the end of page 6. Page 7 begins employment, and there you'll see a number of those that are already existing in the Pierce County countywide planning policies. Land use begins on page 8, and this is talking about, again, the high-capacity transit. There's some comments in here and a couple of other spots as well in the Vision 2040 SEIS talking about green building. And we're just making the point at wherever that's relevant that actually the International Building Code, the International Energy Code are already above and beyond most of what's required across the country and are green. And they already deal with these issues. They don't need to be enhanced even more. And then you also have NPDES and the Pollution Control Board having laid out low impact development being required wherever feasible. So why are we continuing to talk about mitigation of something that's already in place? It's a repetitive, duplicative statement.
There's a feeling here that I don't think PSRC staff understands state enabling legislation. So all these other pieces are already in place. So that's what we're trying to point out in some of this correspondence.
There's conversations about air quality and ecosystems and water, all of which relate to how, again, green development may be happening or how greenhouse gas emission reductions may be happening. And there's some comment here from the city of Lakewood about the fact that there's already a number of things in place that Lakewood already does, and so there doesn't need to be any additional requirements coming down from above. I would like to jump back to housing as, yes?
Yeah, going back to housing, or at least
yeah.
Page 9 there. So on the mitigation measures, it's like on page 9, number 8 and 9, can we not include a comment there about our sub-area plan that we did for the central business district? Because it does impact center and transit station. Lakewood Town Center has a significant transit station, I think. So it'd be worth noting that they've already reviewed and approved that, and it was a significant plan document.
Yes, we can add that.
I would like to also go back a little further on page 6, talking about mitigation number 15, dealing with tenant protections by providing multi-jurisdictional support for local enforcement of codes and affordability, local implementation, and creating a legal defense fund. This and the measure before runs the risk of actually coming off opposite to what I think they intended, and it comes off rather discriminatory and wanting to preserve things, for instance, on the bottom of page 5, naturally occurring affordable housing. What exactly is being referred to there? Yes, yes.
My thought would be we're going to preserve existing red line communities.
Right. Natural occurring, is that just state without some private investment?
Well, we asked a whole bunch of questions on that one, Mr. Whalen.
Well, they've you know, this legal defense fund, you did the right comment here, but that's getting very Seattle-esque. They've become very incredibly, not that it's a bad thing necessarily, very incredibly tenant-friendly to the exclusion of traditional landlord rights. It's very difficult to get rid of a problem tenant downtown Seattle.
The other thing here is they talk considerably at length about inclusionary housing. We have voluntary inclusionary housing in the city of Lakewood, and I think it works. But the other thing about inclusionary housing, when you really think about it, it's a form of rent control.
Right. Totally. And who's going to develop structures that you can't get at least market rate rent for when you've got market rate cost to build?
Yeah.
So I've never heard of the term naturally.
What number is that?
I'm just assuming that that's naturally occurring.
That is a term coined in the Vision 2050 SEIS.
That's their term, not ours. I can't believe they put it in there. It's on page 5, mitigation measure 14.
Prevent displacement and preserve naturally occurring affordable housing. I think we should ask them like that.
I did.
That means substandard housing you let kind of lie fallow. I think I would charge them actually for that as a I would actually question why they would even ask such a question. What is it naturally occurring? I think I know it's called Rainier Valley.
It's Rainier Valley. A bunch of poor people of color moved into an area they could afford, and you're supposed to preserve that instead of giving them an opportunity to get out.
I can't believe they put that. I can't believe the person who wrote that.
there's a, well, here, I don't know that it found its, it may not have found its way into the PSRC mantra yet, but Matt Driscoll at the News Tribune opined on the selection of a bus rapid transit alternative. Happened to be the one that was selected today, and I made the motion. It's the best alternative for a variety of reasons, I believe. But one of the reasons he advocated it was that poor people and people of color were more susceptible to bus pedestrian accidents if the bus was in the curb lane, which is probably the most condescending, racist thing that I've ever heard from a left-wing fanatic. These people aren't smart enough to get out of the way. It's just like telling people who speak Spanish at home or come from a poor family that they aren't smart enough to succeed on a test. It's ridiculous. And I wouldn't be surprised in their transportation policy if there's something similar in here.
There is.
That it's gonna, these people aren't smart enough to get out of the way of a bus. Say that to me, I'd smack you upside the head.
So, I'm sorry.
What?
Read through the lines, you kind of get bad choice words.
No, it's.
The last point that I would draw your attention to is the environmental health comments that are on the bottom of page 16. This is just the start of what's going to be a very robust discussion of health impacts of everything through Vision 2050. It's also coming forward in the county-wide planning policy update that's being talked about right now at the staff level through the GMCC, where all policies, all sections of the county-wide planning policies are being requested for update to incorporate health impacts. And the same thing's going to happen at the regional level. So right now it's just talking about one specific item, but this will be back where all planning needs to pick up and analyze health impacts, whereas in the past maybe there was a separate standalone chapter regarding health. It's now going to get incorporated through everything. So it's just something to be aware of and be prepared to respond to when the draft Vision 2050 document itself comes forward.
If nothing.
See how this impacts or elevates the health department and
right.
its staff.
Right.
That's a good question, and Dr. Chen has a role in this.
Sure. Which provision?
We're on page 16. I will also say this to the council as a whole. We put these statements in here because they have to respond, and I'm real curious as to what they're going to say.
So what I heard through the conversation so far is a little more emphasis on the naturally occurring comments, looking at whether the fact that all of these are pulled directly either from just the county-wide planning policies in Pierce County or multiple counties' county-wide planning policies, and if that's intentional, if that's because really the mindset is stay the course. And then also on page 9, adding in under mitigation measures 8 and 9, reference to the downtown sub-area plan. 8, 9, and 10, okay. So other than that, this letter is ready for additional edits from the council. The thought at this point is to submit it to PSRC at the end of this week, and then also pass it on to the regional coalition group as they draft their regional letter that's going to go in by the end of the comment period at the end of the month.
I got a question. When you were showing those the three scenarios, the transit-oriented scenario seems so set up that that's the one that even King County suburbs would oppose. So it almost seems like they're just really setting it as 2, right? They threw in the 1 because they're just like, maybe there's a few people on staff like Don's talking, but there's probably even communities in King County would say, you know, we're not going to shove everything in 2 cities in King County. The reset urban growth one, the stay the course one seems like, based on the numbers, the best for us. But I'm not.
Well, the way this came about is there were 4 alternatives originally suggested, and the reset urban growth is a combination of 2 previous ones. So it went from 4 to 3, but the intent as voiced by PSRC staff was to say, we have to do no action, which is stay the course. That's always required under an environmental review. So we're gonna include that one. The other 2 we're gonna try to make as different as possible from each other. And that way, if you, as a PSRC, decide to adopt some kind of hybrid, the analysis between these 2 extremes will have covered whatever hybrid you come up with.
But I would also point out that if you start looking at the statistics overall, the percentages don't change a whole lot.
Oh.
So the reasoning behind the SEIS alternatives, that's what was voiced. And at the last Growth Management Policy Board meeting, which was last week, there was continued discussion about how this is going to move forward to a final decision probably by the GMPB in May. Whether or not any of these stand alone as the preferred for anybody, and it sounds like everyone's moving toward we got to figure out some kind of hybrid.
Okay.
And then there was discussion from both Pierce and Kitsap County representatives talking about none of these alternatives as of now recognize the fact that the unincorporated urban areas have vested lots. They have significant vested lots. And so regardless of what alternative you pick, those are going to build out anyway. So you might as well have them reflected in the plan between now and 2050. So change your percentages, whatever you want to call it, recognize the fact, and there's vested lots up in unincorporated Snohomish County as well. They're all going to get built out and they're going to affect the totals. So don't shoot yourself in the foot from the get-go by ignoring those. And there was acknowledgement by other members on the board from other areas that that was the case. So we'll see if that change happens too.
So when it came to, what are you hearing in terms of employment? I mean, we can't be the only people who are saying that this plan of trying to keep employment in about a 10 square mile area in downtown Seattle really is not going to work.
No,
clearly Bellevue is going to get a big hunk of it too. So they have this bipolar situation there. But even other cities in King County can't sit there and say, well, we won't have a tax base to speak of if everything has to be within a certain.
Yeah. I think where people are headed is that transit-focused growth as presented is not going to happen.
Okay.
And then you just have how much resistance, argument, massaging of reset urban growth and transit-focused growth put together are you going to see? So stay the course, standalone is not going to happen either. There's going to be some type of hybrid, and I would say if you're watching it, you'll see some concepts out of transit-focused and then some concepts as well out of reset urban growth just because of the realities of growth patterns since 2000. It's going to be a new, different alternative.
So how far off was Vision 2040?
What they will say to you is that it's within, I believe, 2% of what actually happened. But what you're seeing is that is the entire time frame, as opposed to looking at, for instance, the economics of the last 5 or 6 years. It's something like 85% of all jobs went to King County and City of Seattle. So if you stretch it out, they're that much more accurate over the whole time.
Okay.
But within more recent years, it's become a much sharper distinction between where economic growth is happening, and it's happening in King County and Seattle.
2040 yet, so it's really kind of.
Okay. So yeah, that is a major concern here. I just.
So can we make the argument, and is this the right time? Can we make the argument that the implementation of the PSRC policies from the top down, we pick the denominator, which years we want to discuss, which are the later years, has the results are counterproductive when you are addressing the goals of the Growth Management Act and the transportation needs of the region, which is to employ people close to where they live. So while they think they work and they think they have brilliant policies, they're really counterproductive. So let us plan. I mean,
Transportation congestion and air quality and housing affordability can all now be tied to the results as well. You've got I-5 becoming completely impassable all the time now because there's people commuting to work from where they live. You have housing affordability issues where they can't live where they work. They have to go somewhere else. And then you also have things like sustainability. Should some natural disaster occur in the city of Seattle, falls into the drink, there's no jobs for anybody anywhere because everything was in Seattle. This makes no sense long term. There's all kinds of reasons why it's bad.
Actually, I think we can make a lot of money catering the party.
I think, yeah, I just think that, I mean, this is whistling past the graveyard, but a lot of the growth in Thurston County has been caused by the growth management and these patterns because people don't want to live the way they want them to live. And along Councilmember Simpson's line, reality gets in the way of these things. People say, you know what, if I'm working at the Everett Boeing plant, suddenly Mount Vernon seems like a better, and people will commute that far if they can get down to a 4-day week or something like that. They'll come out of Thurston County. They'll do those kind of things to get away from incredibly high costs or I mean I use us as an example. We're supposed to hit 75,000. I don't see any scenario right now where we're going to hit 75,000. I mean, short of just forced, you will build, and they have to live here. There is no demand. We're the same size we were.
Well, you could see it if you get really attractive housing and amenities here, and maybe better employment in Tacoma, where, for instance, they don't have to schlep. Tacoma's got to be developed.
So what are you going to? Yeah, what are you going to do? Start building 3-story condos on Lake Stillicum Drive? Or
town center, maybe.
That's a lot of people, Mr. Buer.
There's two other alternatives that nobody wants to talk about. One is a slow growth alternative that basically states we don't have the infrastructure to support 1.8 million people. So therefore, we should be restricting the level of development that is being proposed. But heaven forbid that you say that. The other piece to this is that another alternative could very well be, let's focus the jobs in Pierce County and thereby reduce potentially the amount of commuting that's going on, and thereby you fix a lot of other problems. But you really haven't heard that being said yet either. So just an FYI.
Ultimately, this is a paper tiger, if you will, or an attempt to corral in the private market with public policy. And unless and until you enter an era where the government is providing the housing that people live in, they are building it, they are owning it, and or you go to work for the government and that's it, there are no private companies deciding where they want to locate, this is never going to come to full fruition. But we're playing the game and trying to provide some input, as I mentioned earlier to Councilmember Simpson. Maybe you get a tiny victory here and there rather than just not participating.
I've seen it happen a couple places, Abu Dhabi and China.
Thank you. I take your point, Tiffany, because it does remind me, you look when you can't win against the bigger opponent, you look for small victories against that opponent. But I want to come back to your point, Mr. Buer. If we can't beat them the way I'd like to beat them, then let's drag it out. I like your option one, slow walk it, drag it out. I'm just tired. I've sat here for over 5 years, and it seems to me that whenever PSRC comes up, it's all about pushing Pierce County, Lakewood, us around, and I'm tired of that. So let's walk slow.
So, get comments back on these?
Yeah, I just want to give one comment. Is there another, I'm scrambling through the 17 pages, on the economic thing and the job thing, because I think that you got a point there. about maybe incentivizing regional job creation to organically grow more local housing, so we don't have the schlep north for people. But that's something I know that, you know, the economic development boards are working on, and even some of the other.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, it's something that PSRC should have included in this consideration with the 2017, 2018 Regional Economic Strategy, Amazing Place, that was adopted with their own involvement.
Right.
One of the priorities that was put in there very consciously was this regional distribution of economic growth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's important. That would satisfy a lot of the problems.
Yeah. One of the complaints in the past has been some of the ratios for deployment in other cities have been artificially high. There's been complaints from PSC about that. They did not go that route in previous years. And we stay true to who we are as far as what we say. Artificially high. More jobs, way more jobs than were anticipated in Vision 2030.
When you say artificially, you mean?
My guesses on the part of the cities.
Yeah, the estimates, yeah.
So, Mr. Mayor, as I mentioned, where we're at is to receive any other edits and suggestions from all of you through the city manager, and then we'll prepare this letter for distribution by the end of the week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good work.
Yeah, it's a, deep dive. Thank you. Mr. City Manager, back to you.
Just a handful of updates, if I could. So we have, unfortunately, a bit of a scheduling conflict for our volunteer appreciation event, so it's going to be later this month, so we're looking to change it to Friday, May 17th at 7:30 a.m., so you can look for that on your calendar.
So you need a theme?
A theme?
That's sitting to mine.
Don's gonna bring Ludafisk.
It's literally the 17th of May in Norwegian. It's the National Day. It's a very important day.
There you go. All right.
The colors are red,
all right,
white, and blue.
The city clerk picked well. She chose well. If you haven't seen on social media or just in the general news, the I-5 corridor is going to get a little tight here down in Berkeley because over the next week, or actually next week plus, they're going to be closing the lanes in the early morning hours. They're going to be down to one lane, both southbound and northbound. They're putting in the big girders for the new interchange. So just be cognitive of that beginning around 8 or 9 in the evening and then going till about 4:30 in the morning over the next week or so. The Colonial Plaza, if you haven't been by there, staging has begun, so hopefully they'll start turning dirt here. And again, the goal and objective is to have that project completed the September, October timeframe. Tomorrow morning in these council chambers, the Pierce County Economic Development Office and the city's Economic Development Office are going to be co-hosting a Prepare Your Business for Disaster Recovery, and it'll be from 8 to 11 a.m., so if you want to come by and partake, please do. Also this Saturday morning, actually into the afternoon, the Lakewood Youth Council will be hosting their youth expo, and that'll be over at the Boys and Girls Club.
Is there a role for us, or do we show up?
I think they just want you to show up based on the last conversation that you had with them, and
we don't have to stay the whole time.
You don't. You don't. This is for them. This is for them.
Thank you for doing that. Welcome.
Yep. So Councilmember Moss and I will be at the Tacoma Pierce County Black Collective on Saturday morning. So
very good.
And then later on in the month, the last Saturday, of course, is Parks Appreciation Day from 9 to noon. The Developers Forum is scheduled for Thursday, June 13th. One of the key items that is going to be part of that is opportunity zones. I think as the mayor and the council aware, there's 3 areas here in our community. So we have a local individual who's going to come and talk about the opportunity for opportunity zones in Lakewood. Also in early May, the first weekend, May 4th and 5th, we'll have our spring cleanup. We're also looking for volunteers to help facilitate, folks through that. So if you want to come out for a few hours, let us know. We'll be more than happy to have you do that. Chief Zaro will be here as part of your April 22nd study session to provide first quarter police department report and property crimes. So for first quarter, compared to the last 3 years, down 21%, which is 21% property crimes. And they think it probably has to do with retail theft emphasis that began in fourth quarter and has continued into the early part of first quarter. Still too early to tell, but there's probably some good empirical evidence there that that's probably the reason. And just want to compliment Pete Johnson and his team for their focus on that.
21% year over year?
21%. 21%, actually it's about 22% from first quarter of last year, but then if you look at the last 12 quarters, it's down 21%. It's all property crimes. All property crimes, yeah. So it's basically gone down from an average of around 1,130 per quarter to 895. So
could we get a shoplifting only number? Because, anecdotally, there's a lot of frustration with merchants nationwide, but with the inability to do anything about shoplifting. So I'd hope that it isn't all concentrated there because people aren't reporting it.
Right. So and that was actually one of the focuses, was to get the businesses to actually take action on shoplifters as opposed to just let them go. So sending a signal. Also, the police department is going to be conducting their first ever Citizens Academy. It's expected to kick off probably later this summer, mid-July or so, running through September, looking at having about 20, 25 folks. It's not going to be a tactical course or anything. It's going to focus on general, practices of law enforcement and things along those lines. Also have an opportunity for folks to interact with different components of our police department. But again, look for more information on that here in the near future. Also, our streetlights, we have what are called unmetered and metered streetlights. So the metered streetlights, those are really, quite frankly, the easy ones that are attached to the poles, and they're ready to go. But then we have a handful of unmetered streetlights, which require a different level of technical work. Actually, we got to bring in hired electricians just to change the bulb on them. We don't have a lot of them, and we have maybe 15 or 20 incidents a year. And so our Public Works Engineering Director, Paul Busich, was talking to the town of Steilacoom on another issue, and they actually have electricians on staff or folks who are trained. And so we're going to look at drafting an ILA, and we can literally do it for pennies on the dollar compared to what we have to do in the private sector. So it doesn't save a lot of money, but you count your pennies, dollars take care of themselves. So I want to thank the town of Steilacoom for willing to do this for us. So we provide them a lot of services. So here's them providing us some services with their expertise. That's correct. They have an electric. Yeah.
Now, if DuPont would hire a plumber.
So that's where the real expertise is. That's right. That's right. It's not like plumbing. That's right. So, My Lakewood 311, which has been up and running for, since 2015, 2016, and, there's a lot of data on that. And one of the areas that we were, debriefing on last week, and, the area that we actually get the highest number of calls is actually illegal dumping. And so we put together a heat map, and this is not the very good one. We have actually a better one. Well, first of all, this is the first time we actually just mapped it out. And first of all, I'm just going to be frank, this is unacceptable. I've never experienced anything like this in my career. No, this is since 2016. But it doesn't matter if it's a year or if it's 3 years. The illegal dumping that's happening in this community, it's unacceptable. We contacted JBLM, and they too are having a similar problem. They've actually hired a trash cop who goes through the trash to track, because people who do this stuff aren't very smart, and so they find their information, and then they send them a citation, and that actually pays for that position. And I'm not saying that that's where we're going to end up, but we got to resolve this. We're probably not going to be able to get to the people who are actually doing the illegal dumping, but if we can maybe work with Waste Connections, maybe it's an issue of certain areas not having enough dumpsters or people not having, trash, the mandated trash pickup, things along those lines, or even working with JBLM to address this. But what's interesting is the majority of it, the problem areas are actually on the west side of the city, as well as down in some of our isolated neighborhoods like Tillicum and Woodbrook, as well as Springbrook, and then up along unincorporated Pierce County as well. But since we have this data, it's pretty powerful, and but this is just unacceptable. And I've never experienced. If you want to just pass that around, I've never experienced that. I've never experienced that in my career.
So anecdotally, I found that you're absolutely right about well, I should say, what the JBLM experience is probably the norm as opposed to the exception, because having owned apartments where people dumped large quantities and filled your dumpster up, and having had a construction site where people dump stuff, you go through and you find out, oh, it's a guy over there.
Yeah.
Or, and in one case, it was college kids down the street from where we were doing some building, and I took the stuff back and put it on their porch, told them to keep it. And they didn't do it again. But
you mentioned JBLM. A couple of years ago, I did a ride-along with exactly the man you are talking about. On some of those dumpsters out there, they have cameras across the street.
Yeah, we're looking at that too.
So they film. They know who they are. They can read the license plate from the car. And I was with the guy. We went to the guy's house.
Yep.
And he had a choice. You have 8 hours to get your stuff out of that dumpster, or you're facing your unit commander. I mean, it is, and I tell you, it works. But they would, and I had the same thing there. Had the business over there. Yeah. Somebody dumped a bunch of cardboard. Their address was on it. Yep. So I loaded it all up in the truck. It was a house over on Lake Stillicum, and I left it in their front yard. Because I pay for that dumpster, I pay for that lot, and I thought, no, this doesn't work this way. I took it back to the house.
I tried to bring it back to you.
And Jason, I wasn't there.
But actually, the use of technology too with cameras, they're so good today. Those are some, but we'll put together a team to begin to look at this. But at the end of the day, that's a huge image issue. It's unacceptable. And then on top of that, it takes away from a considerable amount of resources for us to be able to do really other stuff. Yeah, rather than being, garbage people. Right. So that's my report, Mayor.
Thank you. Any questions for the city manager? Thank you. Are you going to need an executive session tonight? Okay. Okay, council comments, Ms. Moss.
Briefly, I did attend the Chief's induction ceremony on Friday night, and it was, I enjoy those events. I really appreciate the way they encourage the airman basics and the young men and women that are just coming into the service. So it's always a good program. And I will probably stop by the Boys and Girls Club on Saturday at some point on my way home. Then Saturday night, we have the Lakewood Rotary Sportsman's Dinner at the McGavick Center. So that's all I have.
Mr. Bolke.
I'll be there Saturday. They were working on it tonight. They had a meeting, pre-meeting, and going through the final. Sounds like they've got 60 confirmed, and they're hoping for more at the door. And so they were working at that, and so all ready to go. And they've got the keynote speaker, and they've got music planned in the afternoon, and so it should be a good event. And you're speaking first, I guess, or they're going to introduce you.
I just kind of an introduction and thank them for doing it.
Yep.
It's going to be considerably shorter than the Gettysburg Address, of remarkably lesser quality. Mr. Branstetter.
I attended the Clover Park School District Board meeting this evening before I came here. encourage them to put in an appearance on Saturday and be seen. You know, hopefully that they will do that, because we share investing in those young people's leadership skills, and do that. And I'll be, next Monday morning, I'll be leaving to do the visit to Gimhe as a part of the Sister Cities piece, so I'll miss that meeting and the following, and the following meeting.
Ms. Barth. Mr. Simpson.
272 words in the Gettysburg Address. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
It's on my wall at work. I'll count and check and see if you're right, Mr. Professor. Mr. Whalen.
There is Lakewood United on Thursday. I think we have our own staff member, I think Greg Vigran is presenting on Thursday on the Lake Wahop plan. Wouldn't be a bad idea to have one or more of us show up to that. I would like to, and I probably will. This Saturday, as you know, or as you may know, is the Rotary auction. So if you get a chance to show up that evening, if you don't have our tickets already, it would be a good thing to do. They are planning to raise money for a van, I believe, for Nourish Food is their big project donation this year. So that'll be a great event. It's 5:30-ish to 8:30-ish, so you can probably get some tickets. If you need some, let me know. And we'll go from there. And then I think that's it. And I'm going to that big art scene with you guys on Sunday. Yeah.
Mr. Simpson. Sir. You got 271 words left. Pass. Pretty busy NASCAR next week. I just note that the Pierce Transit Board, before I left the meeting today, approved the what's called a hybrid alternative for the BRT line down Pacific Avenue, which basically splits it up between curbside and down the center line. But it's only at 5% design right now, so it will probably change. It's just which direction to go on the design, and we're still, you know, tens of millions of dollars short in funding.
That December eventually.
Pardon?
That's the one that goes out to.
No, the BRT line is it would go from most of what's currently Route 1, but it would extend down to the Freight House Square transit area, which Route 1 doesn't go down there. It breaks off into downtown Tacoma and down 6th Avenue. So this would be from that area basically out Pacific Avenue to the Roy Y, out to Walmart, and come around with the elevated platform. Think of it as a trolley car on wheels. So you pay before you get on, and you're on a platform that is even with the deck of the vehicle. So we'll see if the feds come through with the majority of the funding. So we will recess into executive session for approximately 15 minutes pursuant to RCW 4231.10(1)I to discuss with legal counsel representing the agency litigation or potential litigation to which the agency, the governing body, or a member acting in an official capacity is or is likely to become a party when public knowledge regarding the discussion is likely to result in an adverse legal or financial consequence to the agency. When the council returns, it is not expected to take any action other than to adjourn. We are in recess. Oops, missed. There we go. 15. Ding, ding.